Welcome to the historic blah, a place where the past moves very slowly, where kings wrote letters that took months to arrive, and farmers counted the seasons, one gentle sunrise at a time. Tonight we'll wander through the calm corridors of history, no wars, no drama, just the quiet turning of time. So take a deep breath, let your thoughts drift like leaves on a still pond. And if you find peace in these sleepy stories, you can like, comment, and subscribe, not out of urgency, but simply whenever you wake up. For now, close your eyes and let history whisper you to sleep. Welcome to Beautifully Boring History. Begin with Story 1, The Feast Before the Frost, Medieval Christmas Meals and Fasting Rituals. You wake up in the damp straw of a 13th century cottage. The air is heavy with smoke. Outside, frost etches feathered patterns across the wooden shutters. The hearth, once glowing, is now cool. Winter has arrived, and with it the sacred quiet before Christmas. But in the world you inhabit, medieval Europe, this is not the season of immediate feasting. No, first comes fasting, and it lasts for nearly 6 weeks. This was Advent, a time of hunger, humility, and hope. From late November through to the Christmas vigil, most of Europe's Christians, particularly those under the influence of the Roman Catholic Church, were bound to reduce their intake of meat, dairy, and even eggs. The Church called it a time of penitence, of reflection. For the poor, already familiar with the ache of empty stomachs, it was not too different from any other month. But for the wealthy, the rules of Advent shaped more than just appetite, it governed the rhythm of their entire winter season. The medieval concept of Christmas was deeply tethered to the church calendar. Unlike our modern celebrations, with decorations popping up in November and festive coffee cups appearing in early fall, medieval Christmas was all about the delay of gratification. People counted the days with candles and psalms, not with chocolate calendars. The role of fasting, a practical and spiritual exercise. In the Middle Ages, fasting didn't necessarily mean complete abstinence from food. Rather, it meant eating differently and less. On fasting days, which could number over 100 annually depending on regional practices, meat from four-legged animals was forbidden. So was animal fat, milk, cheese, and in stricter regions, even eggs. Fish, however, was often permitted, though its availability varied wildly depending on geography. The period leading up to Christmas was one of the major fasting seasons in the year, comparable to Lent. Called the Nativity Fast in Eastern traditions and observed differently in the West, it was both a spiritual exercise and a pragmatic seasonal response. Grain stores needed to last until the next harvest. Cattle had to be slaughtered early in the winter, since feeding them through the coldest months was costly and often impossible. Thus, salting and curing meat was done in late November and early December, just in time for it to become not allowed during the Advent fast. This created a strange contradiction. While food was being prepared for future abundance, the people who made it were not allowed to enjoy it, so they waited, quietly, patiently, devoutly. Monasteries and the regulation of the table. To truly understand the medieval relationship with food during the Christmas season, we must look to monasteries. These were the testing grounds of fasting, the spiritual vanguards of restraint. Monastic rules, especially those derived from the rule of Saint Benedict, outlined exacting details on what monks could eat, how much, and when. For example, monks in Cluny during the 10th and 11th centuries were known for their elaborate Christmas celebrations after Advent. Until then, even the smell of roast meat in the kitchen would be an indulgence best avoided. Meals in December were somber, taken in silence, often consisting of legumes, dark bread, dried peas, or watery pottage. Outside the monastery walls, this austere model shaped village and manor life as well. Lords might bend the rules behind closed doors, hosting quiet feasts under the guise of gatherings, but even they paid lip service to Advent's requirements. In the vast majority of cases, people obeyed. the threat of spiritual consequence of burning in hell for gluttony or failing to prepare one's soul was deeply internalized. Still, there were subtle acts of rebellion, quiet subversions and seasonal irony. Fish was allowed, but what counted as a fish? Medieval minds were wonderfully creative. Beavers with their tails in water were declared fish by some clergy and were thus consumed during fasts. So were barnacle geese in parts of Ireland and Scotland. These birds were believed to be born from driftwood, making them sea creatures in ecclesiastical logic. Likewise, almond milk made by grinding almonds and soaking them in water became a staple milk substitute during Advent, especially for wealthier households. Cookbooks from the period include recipes for almond cheese, almond cream, and even almond butter. These were luxury workarounds, both pious and indulgent. For the poor, though, creativity was a luxury. Turnips, onions, leeks, dried beans, these were the backbone of their December meals. Hunger was constant, and the promise of Christmas, a real feast, was a guiding star. The social weight of food, status, and sacrifice. To share food at Christmas was a deeply social act, not just an expression of wealth or piety, but of status, obligation, and public perception. Lords were expected to feed their retainers. Monasteries were expected to feed the poor. The idea was that after a long fast, those who had should show charity to those who had not. Preparation for these meals began well in advance. Bread had to be baked, ale brewed, pigs slaughtered and salted, and pies filled and sealed. The Christmas feast was the reward for endurance, and no matter how small the house or poor the family, effort was made to mark the nativity with something better than the days before. Sometimes it was a single apple shared among 5, sometimes a bit of honey in porridge, and sometimes a stolen sausage cooked quietly when no one was looking. Final days of waiting, the quiet before the fire. As December stretched on, the waiting grew heavier. Churches filled more frequently. Hymns were sung with greater devotion. The eve of Christmas was not the climax, but the moment before the climax. The fast would end after midnight mass bells would ring out, candles would blaze, and finally the forbidden would be allowed. But not yet. And so, on December 23rd, a mother stirred her bean soup in silence. A monk read the last lines of a psalm, stomach grumbling beneath his robes, and a boy watched through a cracked shutter, eyes wide with wonder, as the Lord's kitchen roasted meats in secret. They all waited, hungry, hopeful. But how did the feast actually unfold once Advent ended? What dishes were served, and what did they reveal about who you were and who you were not? Midnight struck on Christmas Eve. The church bells, long silent except for callings to Advent Mass, echoed across frozen villages and snow-patched hills. Inside the nave, the Latin words of the midnight Mass filled the cold stone walls, Gloria in excelsis Deo. It was the nativity of Christ. The fast had ended. And so people ate. But this was not the kind of holiday indulgence. There were no sugar cookies, no cranberry sauce, no puddings wrapped in foil or ham glazed with honey. Christmas in the medieval world was a feast of limited resources, seasonal ingenuity, and regional distinction. What you ate depended entirely on who you were, where you lived, and how harsh the winter had already become. Let's walk through some tables, noble, peasant, monastic, and uncover the reality behind the long-awaited Christmas meal. The manor table, a display of power and piety. For the nobility, Christmas was an opportunity to perform both generosity and grandeur. The manor hall, often the social and political heart of a lord's estate, was cleaned and decorated with what nature allowed: holly, ivy, yew, and sometimes candles if tallow was plentiful. The centerpiece of the noble Christmas was the meal. It began not with food, but with procession. The dishes were brought out with ceremony. There might be minstrels, horn players, or mummers, masked performers heralding the arrival of each course. The boar's head, often garnished with bay leaves and apples, was the most celebrated of all dishes. Hunting boars was dangerous work, and the successful kill of one symbolized bravery and divine favor. A carol was even composed in its honor, the boar's head in hand bear bedecked with bays and rosemary. Other meat dishes would follow. Goose was common. Capons castrated roosters were a luxury. Sometimes you might find venison, especially if the lord had permission to hunt in royal forests. Pork pies, heavily spiced and sometimes sweetened with fruit, were a staple. Surprisingly, sweet and savory were often combined. Spices like cinnamon, ginger, cloves, and saffron were used even in meat dishes. This wasn't just for flavor, it was display. Spices were imported, costly, and symbolic of wealth and worldliness. The more exotic your dishes, the more impressive your feast. But it wasn't just about taste. Food was deeply symbolic. 3 pies might represent the Trinity. A roasted swan, its feathers reapplied after cooking, could signify purity. A subtlety and edible sculpture made of marzipan or sugar paste might depict the nativity or a local saint. Wine flowed for the privileged, mead for others, ale for many. But the point wasn't just intoxication, it was inclusion. Guests were invited, retainers were fed, musicians were paid, and beggars might be handed meat bones or heels of bread. Charity, though performative, was still expected. Yet even amid the abundance, one rule still held firm: no meat on Christmas Day if it fell on a Friday. The church was never far from the table. The village hearth, modest feasts and shared warmth. For the majority villagers, smallholders, landless laborers, Christmas did not mean opulence. It meant better than usual. In most homes, the Christmas meal was one of the only meat-inclusive feasts of the year, and even then, only if savings or generosity allowed. Roast goose was the most aspirational goal for many peasants. If the family had fattened a bird during the fall, now was the time to cook it. If not, they might roast a chicken or rabbit, or make a thick pottage flavored with bits of salted pork. The smell alone was cause for celebration. Wheat flour was precious, often reserved for feasts. So Christmas bread sweetened with honey or dried berries was a rare delight. Ale, brewed at home in wooden barrels, was served in crude mugs. Butter, eggs, and cheese, forbidden during Advent, now reappeared with symbolic joy. Food was shared, not hoarded. Neighbor brought stew to neighbor. Children went door to door caroling, not for fun but for handouts. Apples, nuts, and bread crusts were common tokens. Sometimes the lucky ones got fig cakes or bits of cured meat. Even the poorest homes tried to honor the day. They might light a Yule candle, burn a log for 12 nights, or hang ivy above the door. The feast wasn't just food, it was community, warmth, and the hope of continuity through winter's grip. The monastic refectory, orderly indulgence. Monks had already endured a strict Advent. Now, even they were allowed to break the fast, but not without rules. Monastic Christmas meals were structured, quiet, and consumed in communal silence while scripture was read aloud. The feast might begin with prayers, followed by 2 or 3 courses lavish by monastic standards, though still austere by secular comparison. You might find roast fish or baked eel, stewed legumes and bread loaves, cheese made from the monastery's own herd, and perhaps on this special day, even red meat, though only in certain orders. Monasteries sometimes distributed food to the poor as part of their Christmas duty. Leftovers, surplus bread, or even portions of meat were handed out at the gates. In some towns, abbeys ran special Christmas kitchens to feed beggars and travelers. Though monks had taken vows of poverty and chastity, they were not immune to the temptations of Christmas. In records from the 14th century, abbots were scolded for ordering too much wine or serving venison in violation of ecclesiastical regulations. And yet the rhythm of their day returned quickly to prayer. They celebrated, but they did not linger. Regional variations and strange delights. Christmas food was not standardized across medieval Europe. A French noble's feast differed from that of an English squire or a German burgher. Even within a single country, ingredients and customs varied by region. In Italy, salted cod became a Christmas specialty. In Spain, Tehran and almond and honey confection was already being consumed by the 15th century. In Northern Europe, beer-basted hams and fruit puddings emerged earlier than you might expect. One particularly odd dish was hedgehog pie, yes, actual hedgehog, eaten by lower classes in parts of Britain and Ireland. Boiled with herbs and covered in crust, it was said to taste earthy and gamey. Another curiosity was the cockintrice, a dish made by sewing together the front half of a piglet and the back half of a capon or goose, roasted as one creature. This grotesque hybrid was less about taste and more about spectacle. Even desserts had their place. Marzipan fruits, wafers made by pressing dough between hot iron molds, rice pudding in the more prosperous South, and frumenty, a sweet porridge made from boiled wheat served with honey and dried fruits. To modern eyes, much of this sounds unappetizing or impractical, but in the Middle Ages it was miraculous. After 6 weeks of denial, this was joy made edible. Leftovers, continuity, and the 12 days. The Christmas meal was not a single event, it marked the beginning of the 12 days of Christmas, stretching from December 25th to January 6th, Epiphany. Each day had its own rhythm. Some were more sacred, like the Feast of Stephen on December 26th. Others, like New Year's, became opportunities for renewed feasting. Leftovers were treasured. Cold meats were stewed, bones boiled for broth, and bread reused in puddings. Nothing was wasted. The idea of overproduction or disposable food was alien to most medieval homes. And as the feast days rolled on, new guests arrived, traveling friars, minstrels, cousins from other manors. Hospitality was essential. Even modest homes opened doors, and some towns enforced laws mandating food distribution during the season. By the time Epiphany arrived, most pantries were thin again. Ale barrels were nearly dry. The Yule log burned low. Winter remained ahead, but now people had tasted the joy of plenty, however briefly. The price of the feast. Yet we must ask, what did this celebration cost? For peasants, Christmas sometimes meant going into debt to afford a goose or grain. For monasteries, it meant stretching limited stores to feed outsiders. For nobles, it meant showing off generosity while quietly managing resources through January and February. And in all this, the church loomed large. Every indulgence was measured against sin. Every bite carried weight. Eating was not just sustenance, it was a spiritual act. And yet people feasted anyway. But how did these traditions begin in the first place? Where did the notion of Christmas food and festivity originate? And how did pagan, Christian, and local customs blend into what became the medieval holiday meal? You sit by the hearth, the last of the goose bones drying on a plate, while the Yule log smolders and creaks in the fire. The scent of roasted barley and grease lingers in the air. Outside, snow muffles the footfalls of late-night wanderers, and inside, bellies are full for now. But what exactly did this celebration grow from? Why the feast at midwinter? Why the hunger before joy? And why, most of all, the urgency to mark this one date, December 25th, with both solemnity and abundance? To understand the medieval Christmas table, we must go backward not just decades, but centuries. The Christian calendar didn't emerge from a vacuum. Rather, it absorbed, repurposed, and transformed the deeply human need to find light in darkness, to anchor hope in the coldest season. And at the heart of it all was food. Pre-Christian midwinter traditions, feasting against the dark. Long before the first medieval mass was sung, European cultures had already learned to mark midwinter with food, fire, and community. In ancient Rome, Saturnalia, a festival in honor of Saturn, god of agriculture, ran from December 17th to around the 23rd. It was a period of gift-giving, role reversal, masters serving slaves, and public feasting. Temples were adorned with greenery, and candles were lit as symbols of warmth and continuation. Across the Germanic and Norse worlds, Yule was celebrated with toasts to the gods, animal sacrifices, and a hearty midwinter feast meant to bridge the darkest days. Boars, in particular, were sacrificed in honor of Freya, the fertility god, which may explain the boar's enduring presence on medieval and modern Christmas tables. These traditions were not just cultural, they were practical. In a world without refrigeration or predictable harvests, midwinter was a logical moment to slaughter livestock that could not be fed through snowbound months. The meat needed preservation often through salting, smoking, or immediate consumption. What better excuse for a feast? In essence, people ate because they had to, but they turned it into a celebration to make survival feel like victory. Christianity's adoption and adaptation. As Christianity spread across Europe from the 4th century onward, church leaders faced a dilemma: how to replace deeply embedded pagan festivals without losing the communal cohesion they provided. The solution was not to abolish, but to reframe. The date of December 25th was not chosen at random. Though the exact date of Christ's birth is unknown and not specified in biblical texts, Church Fathers likely aligned the celebration of the Nativity with pre-existing solstice festivals. The Roman Dies Natalis Solis Invicti, birthday of the unconquered sun, occurred on December 25th. By replacing sun worship with sun worship, early Christians co-opted a festival of light and renewal. Over time, the feasting tradition remained, but its spiritual context shifted. Instead of honoring the gods of the harvest or the return of the sun, the meal now marked the incarnation of Christ the divine entering the mortal world. Still, many old customs clung to the edges of the new holiday. The Yule log, once a pagan fire offering, became a Christian symbol of enduring light. Evergreens, thought to have protective powers in Norse belief, were adopted as symbols of eternal life. Even caroling may have evolved from pagan street songs and wassailing rituals that originally sought blessings from spirits or lords. In all these things, food remained central. It was the anchor of celebration, whether for Saturn, Freya, or the Christ child. Feasting as a social act of reinforcement. By the time we reach the High Middle Ages, 11th–13th centuries, the Christmas feast had become deeply embedded in European social order. But it was more than just a meal. It was a reaffirmation of hierarchy, generosity, and community expectations. Nobles demonstrated their power and wealth by feeding others. Clergy demonstrated their sanctity by tempering indulgence. Villagers affirmed their place in the community by sharing what little they had. This wasn't just hospitality, it was obligation. The Christmas feast was the stage on which medieval society reaffirmed itself each year. Even the smallest act, sharing a bit of buttered bread or a sweetened pudding, was a thread in the social fabric. In towns, guilds often hosted communal meals, where apprentices and masters dined together in rare solidarity. In the countryside, lords might host tenants or host an open meal in the Great Hall. In monasteries, almsgiving increased during the 12 days, with some abbeys distributing loaves, cheese, or meat to local poor. What began as a midwinter survival strategy had become a vehicle for faith and order. The return to fasting, ending the season of joy. By January 6th Epiphany, marking the arrival of the Magi, the Christmas season officially ended. The Yule log, if still burning, was extinguished. In some regions, households collected the ashes and scattered them in fields to bless future crops. But once again, the rhythm returned to denial. After the brief sparkle of feasting, most Christians re-entered a period of fasting or moderation. Lent loomed on the calendar. Hunger returned. This circular motion, fast, feast, fast, was not unique to Christmas. It was central to the medieval understanding of time. Pleasure was allowed, but only briefly. Discipline, hunger, and sacrifice were always waiting. Yet the memory of the Christmas meal remained. It was more than meat and drink. It was a moment where the world turned on its axis, however briefly, and where the cold was forgotten in the glow of hearths and candles. Modern echoes of medieval Christmas feasting. You may find traces of this old world in your modern celebrations, though softened and sanitized. The turkey dinner, now central to many Christmas tables, replaces the medieval goose or boar. Fruitcake echoes the dense, spiced breads of old. The idea of a 12-day holiday season lives on, even if most people can't name more than a few days in it. Even the notion of indulgence during the holidays, followed by resolutions and diets in January, mimics the fast-feast-fast rhythm of medieval piety. But what's missing, perhaps, is the deeper understanding of why we feast. In the medieval world, food was never just nourishment. It was theology, politics, survival, and storytelling served on a trencher and passed with reverence. Even the dullest bread crust had meaning when eaten after 6 weeks of restraint. Final reflections: the legacy of the hungry holiday. The medieval Christmas meal teaches us something powerful, that joy, when paired with hardship, becomes sacred. The hunger of Advent made the feast matter. The cold of December made the fire feel divine. Today, it's easy to forget these rhythms. We live in a world of constant availability. Food is rarely seasonal. Celebration is rarely delayed. And hunger real, knowing hunger is thankfully rare for many. But perhaps that's why the story of medieval Christmas is worth telling, slowly and in full detail. Because in its rhythm, its restraint and release, we glimpse a different kind of life. One in which food was precious, time was sacred, and even a bowl of stew could feel like a miracle. So next time you light a candle or lift a glass in midwinter, imagine the monk carefully slicing cheese after weeks of abstention. Imagine the peasant boy marveling at the first meat he's seen since November. Imagine the noblewoman stirring spiced wine, aware of her duty to give some away. And ask yourself not what there is to gain, but what it once meant to wait. Story 2. Decking the halls with wattle and dung, Yuletide decorations in the Middle Ages. When you picture Christmas, what do you see? Twinkling lights, pine-scented wreaths, red velvet ribbons, plastic holly berries, maybe even a slightly crooked artificial tree. Now erase all of that. You are standing in a 12th century peasant home, built of wattle and daub woven sticks packed with mud and dung. The roof leaks a little. The floor is trodden earth. There is no chimney, only a smoke hole. And yet it's nearly Christmas, and this small, humble space is about to be decked not with glitter and glass, but with what the season and the countryside provide. The medieval Christmas was not without decoration, but its symbols, scents, and colors were rooted in tradition, scarcity, and deep symbolic meaning, far from the commercial sparkle of modern holidays. And most of all, it was a communal effort, grounded in the rhythms of the land and the cycle of faith. Evergreens, more than just pretty leaves. The most iconic medieval holiday decoration was not the tree, it was the greenery. Holly, ivy, yew, bay, rosemary, and boxwood were all common. Each had symbolic meaning, though much of that meaning was a palimpsest of older, pre-Christian associations overwritten with Christian interpretations. Holly, with its spiked leaves and red berries, was said to represent the crown of thorns and drops of Christ's blood. Ivy, which clings to walls and survives winter, symbolized resilience and eternal life. Yew was associated with mourning and immortality, a fitting decoration for both Christmas and funerals. Bay and rosemary were thought to purify the air and ward off illness or evil spirits. These greens were gathered in the days leading up to Christmas Eve. This wasn't just a custom, it was a necessity. There were no synthetic decorations, no stores selling seasonal flair. What you hung in your home was what you could cut from nearby hedgerows and woods, assuming you had permission, of course. Even in town centers where forests were scarce, households might purchase bundles of greenery at winter markets. Children, especially, were sent to collect the leaves, sometimes singing as they went. It was a chore, but also a form of anticipation. The act of decorating marked the beginning of celebration. Homes would hang boughs above doors, in rafters, and along hearth mantels. Sometimes they were twisted into garlands, other times tied into rudimentary wreaths. The idea of a Christmas tree, as we know it, would not appear in full form until the 16th century in Germanic regions. Before that, green was not a centerpiece, it was a frame. Scented sanctity, herbs, smoke, and air fresheners of a different kind. Medieval homes did not smell fresh. Between livestock indoors, smoke from the hearth, damp thatch, and human presence, most indoor spaces carried an odor that modern sensibilities would find challenging. Christmas was one of the few times of year when this was intentionally addressed. Homes and churches alike were fumigated with herbs. Rosemary, bay, and juniper were burned for scent and purification. This wasn't just for olfactory pleasure, it was thought to cleanse the air spiritually and physically. Disease was believed to spread through miasmas, or bad air, and winter was a time of coughs and death. As such, medieval people, especially in wealthier homes, used Christmas as a moment to ritually clean the air. Even peasants might throw herbs on the fire or place bunches above doorways to protect against illness. In churches, incense took on this role. The use of frankincense and myrrh, both exotic and expensive, was symbolic of the Magi's gifts to Christ, but it also filled the cold stone with warmth and fragrance. The mingling of scent and worship was intentional. To smell something sacred was to feel something sacred. Color without dye, natural beauty and symbolic simplicity. Red, green, and gold may dominate modern Christmas aesthetics, but medieval color schemes were dictated by availability and meaning. Green was everywhere because evergreens were abundant. Red, in the form of holly berries or dried apples, was rare and striking. Gold, actual gold, was reserved for churches, royals, and the very wealthy, often appearing as gilded ornaments or cloths on altars. White represented purity, often used in the form of candles or winter linen. Blue, the color of the Virgin Mary's cloak in iconography, was used in religious settings, but less so in domestic ones due to the cost of blue dye. In homes, decoration was often minimal but meaningful. A sprig of holly above the doorway, a small cross carved into a wax candle, a wooden bowl filled with winter fruits like dried figs or nuts. Some wealthier households might display illuminated manuscripts or icons with seasonal imagery. In rare cases, cloth hangings with embroidered scenes of the Nativity or saints were brought out for the occasion, used to dress the walls of great halls or chapels. But for most people, the beauty of Christmas came not from opulence but from transformation. A dark, smoky cottage suddenly made green and bright, a cold chapel filled with candlelight, a world dressed in decay, touched briefly by life again. The Yule log, fire as decoration and devotion. More than just fuel, the Yule log was both decoration and ritual. Typically a large piece of oak or ash, the Yule log was brought into the home on Christmas Eve, often with some ceremony. It was supposed to burn for all 12 days of Christmas from December 25th to January 6th. In reality, most logs did not last that long, but the symbolism endured. The fire was to protect the home, ward off evil spirits, and bring light to the darkest days. Some regions kept ashes from the previous year's Yule log to mix into the new one, creating a sense of continuity and blessing. Decorating the log itself wasn't widespread, but in some places it was adorned with holly or sprinkled with cider before lighting a small libation to the spirits of hearth and home. Outdoor and public decorations, modest but communal. Most medieval towns and villages did not decorate streets or public squares the way modern cities do. There were no lights strung from rooftops, no window displays. However, churches and guild halls were exceptions. They were often adorned with evergreens, candles, and symbolic banners. On major feast days during the Christmas season, town squares might be swept clean and decorated with fir boughs or strewn herbs, temporary touches to mark sacred time. In some places, nativity scenes were acted out rather than displayed, since few households had the materials to create visual displays. These performances, often held in churches or churchyards, featured live animals and community participation. They were, in a sense, living decorations, part pageant, part worship. Occasionally, wealthier towns sponsored the installation of public cribs or tableaus made of wood or clay, featuring the Virgin Mary, Joseph, and the Christ child, along with angels, shepherds, and the Magi. But these were exceptions, not norms. The medieval approach was not to fill space with objects, but to mark time with presence. Why decorate at all? In a world of scarcity, where every resource was counted, why spend energy decorating? The answer lies in sacrality and structure. To decorate was to distinguish sacred time from ordinary time. By transforming space, even modestly, people participated in the sanctification of the season. Hanging ivy didn't just brighten the room, it marked the house as a space of celebration. Lighting a candle on the altar didn't just illuminate, it invited the presence of the divine. More practically, the act of decorating created communal activity. Families gathered greenery together. Guild members hung herbs in their halls. Children were sent to fetch pine cones or berries. It was participatory, grounding, and deeply tied to the land. In the absence of commercial spectacle, medieval Christmas decorations were not about display. They were about devotion. Closing thoughts. So there you are, standing in that smoky cottage or dim chapel. The fire crackles behind you. The air smells of rosemary and damp yew. Holly leaves cast long shadows on the wall, and a single candle flickers near a wooden image of the Virgin. There is no glitter, no synthetic garland, no countdown to a gift exchange. But the space has changed. The season has begun. Still, one question lingers. How did the church shape these customs, and what rules or superstitions governed what could and could not be done in the name of decoration? As you lean closer to the fire, listening to the gentle hiss of green holly crackling in the hearth, you might wonder who decided what these decorations meant. Why were certain plants welcome, others forbidden? Why did some homes fill with greenery while others remained bare? The answers, like most things in medieval life, were shaped by the church, folk tradition, and a heavy dose of practicality. In this section, we'll examine how ecclesiastical teachings influenced domestic and public decoration, what kinds of beliefs surrounded the humble garland, and how even decorating one's home could tread dangerously close to heresy or worse, superstition. The church's view, sacred symbol or pagan remnant. By the 12th century, Christianity had long since spread across Europe, bringing with it a vast network of clerical oversight. The church did not necessarily object to decorating homes or churches for Christmas, but it was deeply concerned with why people were doing it. There was a constant tension between tolerating pre-Christian customs and rooting them out. For example, the widespread use of evergreens was a legacy of earlier winter solstice festivals like Saturnalia in Rome or Yule in Germanic regions, where plants that stayed green in winter were thought to possess mystical power. When these plants began showing up in Christian households, the church had a choice: ban them or redefine them. So redefine them it did. Holly became associated with Christ's passion, its red berries seen as drops of blood, and its sharp leaves as a crown of thorns. Ivy was framed as a symbol of faithfulness, clinging to Christ as it clung to walls. Laurel and bay, once sacred to Apollo, were reimagined as emblems of victory over sin. This Christianization of plant symbolism was a strategic adaptation. By assigning sacred meanings to old customs, the church retained control over them. Still, not all clergy were comfortable with such compromises. Some early church fathers and later reformers denounced these practices as superstitio, a term used to condemn ritual behavior not sanctioned by church doctrine. Superstition, in medieval theology, was not just innocent error, it was spiritually dangerous. Decorating with holly, acceptable if you understood its meaning. Hanging charms, twigs, or plants believed to ward off evil spirits or witches. That, in the eyes of the church, veered toward paganism or folk magic. So began a centuries-long tug-of-war between church-sanctioned symbolism and folk belief. Folk traditions, warding off spirits blessing the herds. While priests might sermonize about symbolism, villagers had their own ideas. In many rural communities, decorating was not just about joy or celebration, it was protective. Certain plants were thought to have the power to prevent illness from entering the home, ward off malevolent spirits that roamed during the long winter nights, ensure fertility of animals and crops come spring. These beliefs ran deep. In parts of England, for instance, it was said that bringing greenery into the home too early before Christmas Eve would invite bad luck or illness. Likewise, leaving it up past Candlemas, February 2nd, risked offending the household spirits. Superstitions also dictated how decorations were hung. Holly and ivy were often placed over doorways, or in ceiling beams places where evil might enter or linger. In livestock barns, bunches of yew or juniper were sometimes hung above stalls to protect animals from disease during the harshest months. These beliefs persisted because they fit naturally into the agricultural cycle. Winter was a dangerous time. Illness spread, food ran low, animals miscarried or died of cold. To decorate was to act not just in faith but in fear. Even the timing of decoration, especially in peasant homes, was guided by the lunar calendar, folklore, and oral tradition, more so than church edicts. Monasteries and cathedrals formalized symbolism and sensory awe, while village homes carried a mix of Christian and folkloric decoration. Monasteries and cathedrals followed a more rigid set of guidelines. Yet even here, decoration played a vital role. Cathedrals would be adorned with greenery, candles, embroidered hangings, and iconography, often depicting the Nativity, the Annunciation, or the genealogy of Christ. In some cases, especially in Benedictine or Cluniac monasteries, the entire chapter house or refectory was subtly dressed for the occasion. Garlands of bay or rosemary draped around pillars. Special altar cloths with gold embroidery brought out just for the season. Candles in abundance, symbolizing Christ as the light of the world. There was a theology of decoration at work. Ornamentation was not vanity, it was a didactic tool used to teach and inspire. Monks believed in modest beauty. Overindulgence was frowned upon, but sensory richness, especially through light and scent, was embraced during feast days. The contrast between Advent's visual austerity and Christmas's brightness served to highlight the miracle of the Incarnation. In other words, the more barren the buildup, the more beautiful the breakthrough. Guild halls and urban homes, civic pride and pageantry. In towns and cities, trade guilds and merchant households also participated in Christmas decoration, though theirs leaned more toward pageantry and public display. Guild halls were often draped in evergreen boughs, hung with lanterns, and cleaned thoroughly. Some decorated with heraldic banners or painted panels showing scenes of the Nativity or St. Nicholas. Urban homes, particularly those of wealthier merchants, might decorate their thresholds and windows, especially on Christmas Eve, to announce their piety and prosperity. In places like London, Norwich, or Bruges, this civic form of celebration mirrored religious observance but also showcased social status. In some towns, Records survive of guild-sponsored decorations in public spaces, especially for processions or church plays. Drapes and bunting in red and blue, fresh herbs strewn on cobblestones, even tapestries hung outdoors from second-floor balconies. This was decoration as civic ritual, meant to unite community under the banner of sacred celebration. Church edicts and popular pushback. Despite its central role in shaping practice, the church occasionally had to curb enthusiasm or at least guide it. By the 13th century, some diocesan synods began issuing statements about excessive or inappropriate decoration, especially within churches. Concerns included using plants with pagan associations, spending too much on imported herbs or cloths, inappropriate imagery on hangings, like secular or mythological scenes. In extreme cases, the church reminded the faithful that adorning the house should not come before adorning the soul. And yet popular customs rarely obeyed such rebukes entirely. Villagers still snuck in extra garlands. Markets still sold lucky berries in late December. Children still hung small tokens above the hearth, hoping for gifts or at least good dreams. This was the true balance of medieval Christmas, obedience with a touch of quiet rebellion. Symbolism layered on symbolism. It is striking how much meaning was packed into every leaf and branch. In an age where few could read or write, visual and sensory symbolism was crucial. A sprig of holly in the hall wasn't just pretty, it invoked suffering, redemption, and protection. A candle wasn't just light, it was Christ present. A garland was a circle of eternity, unbroken. Even the act of cleansing the house, sweeping before hanging greenery, was spiritual as much as practical. Dirt and dust were not just mess, they were symbols of sin, cleared away before the holy day. People decorated not for beauty's sake, but to enter into sacred time. Each object marked the space as set apart. But did it all work? And still we must ask, in the middle of winter, with food scarce, disease rampant, and spirits low, did these decorations matter? Yes, because they were not just ornamental. They were acts of resistance against despair. In a world that offered little comfort in January's grip, even a green branch could mean hope. In the corner of a hut, a child might trace the leaves of ivy and believe that spring would come. In the cold nave of a church, a flickering candle might remind a widow that light still lived. In a smoky guild hall, a garland of rosemary might spark laughter among tired men sharing ale. In these ways, decoration was not a luxury. It was a necessity, a reminder of meaning amid the mundane, a bit of color in a monochrome world. But the question remains, how did these customs evolve into the Christmas trees and tinsel we know today? When did garlands become glitter? When did the humble holly bow out for baubles? To trace that story, we must follow the path of change through centuries of reform, invention, and empire. The fire burns lower now. You can smell the faint scent of rosemary smoke rising from the hearth, and the last of the Yule greenery has started to brown at the edges. The church bells no longer chime for Christmas but for Epiphany. The 12 days are over. It's time to take the decorations down. But not too late. Because by Candlemas February 2nd they must be gone. Anything left hanging beyond that point risks inviting bad luck. Such was the medieval belief. But what became of these customs? Where did the holly and ivy decorations go? And how did a modest tradition rooted in winter survival and sacred timekeeping transform into the glittering, light-filled spectacle we now recognize? This final section traces the long, winding journey of medieval Christmas decoration from sacred bough to blinking light bulb. Early modern shifts, Protestantism, Puritanism, and the war on Yule. The greatest transformation of medieval Christmas traditions began not with technology, but with theology. With the Protestant Reformation in the 16th century, many of the religious justifications for Christmas rituals, especially decoration, were called into question. Reformers such as Martin Luther and John Calvin criticized practices they saw as superstitious, wasteful, or unbiblical. In some Protestant regions, Christmas celebrations were stripped down or banned altogether. In Scotland, the Kirk outlawed Christmas celebrations in the late 16th century. For over 300 years, it was not officially a public holiday. In England, under Puritan rule during the 1640s and 1650s, Parliament banned Christmas as a popish festival. Markets stayed open, churches were shuttered, and decorating homes with greenery was forbidden. These changes were not always accepted quietly. In towns like Canterbury, pro-Christmas riots broke out when officials tried to remove decorations from homes. People resisted. They needed their greenery. But these moments marked a turning point. The Christian justification for decoration weakened, and public Christmas decor faded from view in many Protestant countries for nearly 2 centuries. What survived did so quietly in private homes, in Catholic regions, or embedded in folk tradition under different names. Survivals in rural folk practice. Despite official disapproval, many rural communities preserved medieval-style Christmas decoration well into the 18th and 19th centuries. In country cottages and isolated hamlets, people still gathered holly and ivy, burned a Yule log, hung boughs in barns to protect animals, created simple nativity altars or home shrines with seasonal greenery. These customs often lost their overt Christian meanings but retained their ritual function, marking time, ensuring luck, and breaking up the monotony of winter. In parts of Wales, for instance, Calannig, New Year's gifts and greenery included sprigs of mistletoe or rosemary carried from house to house. In southern France, families built small creches nativity scenes decorated with moss and twigs. The church might have changed, but the people still looked to nature and to each other to mark the holy season. The Christmas tree arrives. The Christmas tree, now the most recognizable holiday symbol in much of the world, did not exist in the medieval West. Its origins are found later, in the Renaissance-era German-speaking lands, likely emerging from a fusion of sacred plays, evergreen symbolism, and domestic piety. By the 16th century, Germans began setting up small indoor trees or paradise trees, decorated with apples representing the Garden of Eden, for December 24th, the feast day of Adam and Eve. These trees were later adorned with wafers, sweets, candles, and eventually ornaments. The custom was slow to spread and remained mostly regional for centuries. When Prince Albert, the German husband of Queen Victoria, popularized the tree in England during the 1840s, it was a novelty and exotic import. But newspapers and illustrations caught the public's imagination. Soon, the tree supplanted the garland as the centerpiece of holiday decoration. Ironically, this newer tradition, born from Renaissance theater and pious symbolism, quickly replaced older practices like Yule logs and ceiling boughs, but not entirely. Holly and ivy remained as trimming. Rosemary still scented some homes, and the tree absorbed much of their symbolism, becoming a vertical altar of light and color. Industrialization and the age of manufactured cheer. By the late 19th and early 20th centuries, decoration became commercialized. What had once been gathered by hand was now produced in factories. Glass ornaments were made in Germany and Bohemia. Tinsel, originally made from silver, became mass-produced. Electric Christmas lights were introduced in the 1880s, replacing candles. And so, homegrown decoration gave way to store-bought spectacle. In cities like London, Paris, and New York, department stores began putting up elaborate holiday displays. Public trees decorated not with meaning, but with mass appeal became the norm. This shift wasn't just aesthetic. It reflected a deeper transformation in the meaning of Christmas. What had once been a holy day became a holiday, focused increasingly on family, nostalgia, and consumption. Still, traces of the medieval remained. Wreaths and garlands are still hung on doors and mantels. The Yule log lives on in cake form, the French bûche de Nile. Mistletoe, once a sacred druidic plant, is still hung awkwardly in doorways. Even carols about holly and ivy endure songs, whose lyrics originated centuries earlier, often in tension with or in tribute to the church. Rediscovery and revival, the medieval nostalgia movement. In the 19th and 20th centuries, interest in old Christmas traditions surged, thanks to writers like Charles Dickens, Washington Irving, and the antiquarian movement. Medieval-style celebrations were romanticized. Wassailing came back into fashion. Boar's Head feasts were revived in Oxford and Cambridge. Churches and cathedrals began using historically informed decorations, based on medieval calendars and liturgical colors. In recent decades, living history sites, cathedral festivals, and folk groups have brought back the medieval Christmas aesthetic. Natural greenery, candlelit services, and even period-accurate decorations made from cloth, wax, or wood. These revivals, while often idealized, point to something enduring, a longing for a slower, more meaningful, less commercial kind of celebration. A world where the smell of yew and rosemary, not the click of a purchase, marked the coming of Christmas. Reflection: what do we really need to feel festive? Perhaps the lesson of medieval decoration is not how much we've changed, but how little we actually need. A bough of greenery, a flickering candle, a handmade token, a shared ritual. These simple acts once transformed cold, rough spaces into sanctuaries of hope, not through expense, but through intention. In a time when light was scarce, warmth fleeting, and death never far, people still gathered rosemary, still lit fires, still told stories under ivy-shaded beams. They made sacred space with what they had. And in doing so, they sanctified not just their homes but their hearts. So next time you place a wreath on your door or untangle a string of lights, remember that once, long ago, someone in a mud-walled cottage pressed holly into a rafter not for beauty, but for protection. Not for show, but for faith. And maybe that's what decorating is still really about: not display, but defiance. A declaration that in the darkest time of year, we will still make room for light. Story 3. The 12 Days of Rule Bending. How Lords Became Servants and Vice Versa. You wake up in a stone manor hall, but something is off. The steward, who yesterday barked orders at the kitchen staff, is now wearing a garland of ivy and dancing badly to the beat of a drum. A lowly stable boy is seated on the dais where the Lord usually dines, wearing a crude crown made of straw and tin. Servants are singing rude songs with the priest, and someone just pelted the bailiff with a stale pie. This is not rebellion. This is Christmas. And for the next 12 days, from December 25th to January 6th, the social rules of medieval society will bend, sometimes break, and in rare cases, even reverse entirely. It was a time called misrule, a celebration that took many forms: the boy bishop, the feast of fools, the lord of misrule, and the 12th night king. These customs were not merely entertainment. They were social safety valves, pressure releases that allowed people to laugh at authority, invert hierarchies, and survive the long winter with a dose of absurdity. But where did these traditions come from? And why was the church so often strict and solemn, complicit in this chaos? The 12 days, stretching out the celebration. To understand Christmas misrule, you must first understand the calendar. In the medieval world, Christmas did not end on December 25th. That day merely began the 12 days of Christmas, culminating in Epiphany on January 6th, the feast commemorating the arrival of the Magi. These 12 days were a continuous celebration, marked by feasting, gift-giving, often on New Year's or Epiphany, games and entertainments, Special religious services. The long span between Christmas and Epiphany allowed room for different traditions to unfold, some sacred, some profoundly silly. It was within this space that the rules relaxed, inversion took root, and people could safely indulge in behavior that would be unthinkable at any other time of year. The Lord of Misrule, mock kings and anarchy in the hall. Perhaps the most iconic figure of Christmas inversion was the Lord of Misrule. Also known as the Abbot of Unreason in Scotland or Master of Revels in court circles, this person was typically chosen from among the lower ranks, sometimes a servant, apprentice, or choir boy. Once crowned, he presided over revelry, mockery, and organized mischief. Dressed in rags, ribbons, or bright mismatched clothing, he might lead parades through the manor or town, issue nonsense edicts such as declaring that ale must be drunk from shoes, call for feasts, games, or parody performances, playfully mock clergy or nobility within limits. The Lord of Misrule was both clown and king. His authority was temporary but absolute within the scope of foolishness. In some accounts, even lords and ladies were expected to obey his absurd orders. But this was not an anarchic free-for-all. The tradition was ritualized and time-bound. By January 6th, the Lord of Misrule would step down, sometimes in a staged execution, sometimes with a simple farewell. Order returned. The boy bishop, when children took the mitre. The inversion of authority was not limited to secular lords. Within the church, a similar role reversal occurred. The boy bishop, typically selected on December 6th, the feast day of St. Nicholas, the patron saint of children. A choir boy was chosen to act as bishop for a limited period, often until Holy Innocents' Day on December 28th. During this time, the boy bishop might dress in full episcopal vestments, lead processions, deliver sermons, sometimes humorous or satirical, bless the congregation, distribute small gifts or treats. Though he did not perform the sacraments, the boy bishop was a visible and ceremonial leader, often drawing large crowds. This practice began as early as the 10th century and was especially popular in England, France, and Spain. It highlighted themes of innocence, humility, and reversal. The last shall be first. But not all approved. The more austere elements of the church viewed the boy bishop with suspicion, even disdain. Critics saw it as a mockery of holy office. Yet it endured, perhaps because people saw in it a necessary balance, a time when even the most powerful institution in medieval life could be approached with gentle humor. The Feast of Fools, sacred and silly collide. Among the most controversial of misrule traditions was the Feast of Fools, typically held around the circumcision of Christ on January 1st or Holy Innocents' Day. This was a quasi-liturgical event, primarily in cathedrals and monasteries, where junior clergy or subdeacons would take over the service and turn it on its head. What did that look like? Sacred hymns sung in mock Latin or reversed syllables. Clergy wearing animal masks or dressing as women. Processions through town with donkeys in tow, sometimes into the church itself. The celebrant riding a donkey or goat to the altar, braying instead of saying Amen. Though rooted in earlier Roman and Gallic festivities, the Feast of Fools was absorbed into Christian liturgical calendars, then later expelled, as church authorities became uneasy with its excesses. By the 13th and 14th centuries, efforts to ban or restrict the practice increased. Bishop Robert Grosseteste and the Council of Basel both condemned the feast as scandalous. Yet it survived in various forms until the Reformation, and echoes remain in Mardi Gras and carnival traditions today. Why did misrule exist at all? You might ask, why did a society so hierarchical, so deeply concerned with order and rank, even encourage these brief moments of inversion? The answer lies in release. Medieval life was full of pressure. Rigid class systems, heavy taxation, religious fear and penitence, backbreaking labor, and seasonal deprivation. Misrule offered a ritualized outlet, a chance to laugh at authority, to taste equality, if only for a few days. It was not rebellion. It was licensed transgression, a holiday of humility, reminding all that rank was temporary and fortune could change. By flipping the world briefly upside down, the people reaffirmed their ability to return to structure without resentment. In short, to endure hierarchy, it had to be mocked now and then. The boundaries of fun. But make no mistake, there were limits. Misrule was closely watched. Lords tolerated parody, not real challenge. Priests chuckled at mock sermons, but not blasphemy. Servants could give orders, but only within the holiday frame. Cross the line, and punishment followed. Some accounts tell of lords of misrule who grew too bold, too bawdy, or too real in their critiques, only to be removed, whipped, or even imprisoned. It was a dangerous line to walk. Make them laugh but not think too hard. Still, the tradition persisted, in castles and cottages alike. Even peasants might name a mock king, among themselves, to lead carols or plan small games in the village green. From manor to monastery, the 12 days were a time of sanctioned silliness and often of subtle truth-telling disguised as jest. As the garlands wilted and the candles burned low, the boy bishop returned his mitre. The lord of misrule took off his jester's crown. The children grew quiet again. The stables were cleaned. The lords returned to the dais. But what did all of this inversion really accomplish? And how did these customs survive or perish in the centuries that followed? The fire has burned down to its embers. The king of misrule has just been pelted with the last apple from the feast. The steward is back in uniform, straight-faced, counting barley sacks and grumbling about ale consumption. The mock bishop bows, returns his vestments, and rejoins the choir boys in the stalls. The holiday is over. The world is right side up again. But what if it didn't go back? What if misrule lingered, turned sour or seditious? What if the laughter stopped being innocent? In this section, we look more closely at how Christmas misrule was policed, how some took it too far, and how the church and monarchy responded over time. Because even temporary chaos needed boundaries. When the veil between order and disorder thinned, the authorities took note. When fun becomes threat. While most accounts of Christmas inversion are light-hearted boy bishops, dancing clergy, foolish kings, some crossed the line into genuine unrest. In 1445, a lord of misrule in a London parish led a rowdy parade through town that escalated into a brawl with a rival group, resulting in smashed stalls and injuries. Local aldermen fined the instigators and suspended the practice for several years. In 1526, under the court of King Henry VII, the appointed lord of misrule Edward Ferrers organized games and masques that openly satirized members of the royal court. Though the king laughed, others did not. Several participants were quietly reprimanded afterward. Even earlier, some cathedral chapters complained that the Feast of Fools had become an excuse for drunkenness, indecency, and mockery of sacred rites. Clergy were said to have danced in vestments, sung gibberish in choir, and mimicked animals at the altar. The line between ritualized reversal and disorder was razor-thin. While authorities tolerated satire, they feared escalation. Too much mockery and you weren't playing. You were criticizing, and criticism, especially public and creative, was dangerous. The Reformation, a crackdown on misrule. The Protestant Reformation in the 16th century brought a sweeping reevaluation of holiday customs. Reformers saw many forms of Christmas misrule as superstitious, relics of pagan festivals; irreverent, mocking sacred offices; carnal, encouraging gluttony, lewdness, and disorder; wasteful, lavish feasts and games amid moral decay. In England, under the influence of Puritanism, misrule faced sharp opposition. By the mid-17th century, the boy-bishop tradition was suppressed. The Lord of Misrule was condemned as a relic of popish folly. Christmas itself was abolished by the Puritan-led Parliament in 1647. Shops stayed open, churches closed their doors, even decorating homes with greenery became a sign of resistance. In response, many defiant celebrations took place in secret. Greenery smuggled indoors. Carols whispered after dark. Homemade masks and parades on Twelfth Night in rural areas, despite the risk. Ironically, by banning Christmas and its customs, the Puritans gave new political meaning to misrule. What had once been safe play became symbolic defiance. And after the restoration of Charles II in 1660, many old customs returned but not unchanged. From parody to performance, the birth of modern pantomime and masque. As medieval misrule faded, new forms of performance emerged, particularly in courts and theaters. Court masks highly stylized performances with music, dance, and allegorical themes replaced some of the ritual inversions. These were still playful, but carefully choreographed and sponsored by monarchs. Twelfth Night entertainments evolved into pantomime, a form of comedic theater with cross-dressing, slapstick humor, and audience interaction. Many pantomimes retained traces of the Lord of Misrule, a fool leading chaos but now on stage, not in the hall. The inversion had moved from life to literature, from hall to proscenium. The people still laughed, but the power to invert had been safely contained within fiction. Twelfth Night, the final farewell to chaos. The culmination of the misrule period was Twelfth Night, January 5th, the eve of Epiphany. By this point, feasts reached their most lavish. A Twelfth Night cake was often baked with a hidden bean or pea inside. Whoever found it became the king or queen of the night. Masquerades and plays were staged. The last vestiges of misrule were enjoyed before order returned. This tradition of Twelfth Night royalty continued long after other misrule practices faded. Even in the 18th and 19th centuries, English households still baked king cakes, held parlor games, and sang old carols that traced their lineage to earlier, wilder times. In France, the galette des rois survives to this day. In Spain and Latin America, El Dia de los Reyes remains a gift-giving holiday rooted in Epiphany and shaped, centuries earlier, by these medieval cycles. But for most of Europe, the role-revering core of misrule gradually receded into memory, replaced by new hierarchies: bourgeois, bureaucratic, and industrial. What we lost and what we kept. The end of misrule was not abrupt. It dissolved slowly, its memory lingering in. Holiday parties with silly hats and cracker crowns. Mock elections of kings and queens during New Year festivities. Office party traditions where the intern gives a toast and the boss pretends to laugh. These are pale echoes of the real thing, but they point to something deeper: the human desire to occasionally reverse the flow, to mock authority, to laugh together at the absurdity of roles. Even Santa Claus, the ultimate modern Christmas figure, bears traces of misrule. He comes uninvited. He knows your secrets. He judges the high and low alike. He gives gifts to the undeserving and punishment to the proud. And in many traditions, especially older European versions, St. Nicholas was accompanied by darker companions: Krampus, necked Ruprecht, the Yule goat figures who punished, parodied, or frightened. They are, in their own way, the last lords of misrule. Was it all just a joke, or was there a deeper purpose? As we look back at misrule, we are left with the unsettling possibility that what seems like frivolity was actually a cultural safety net. In a rigid society, misrule allowed expression of resentment or frustration, mockery of unfairness and power, relief from the daily grind of obedience, bonding across social boundaries, however temporary. It was licensed liminality, a ritual time in which you were permitted to step outside of yourself, and maybe even glimpse the absurdity of the world around you. And perhaps it reminded those in power that they, too, were just actors on a stage that would, one day, be swept clean again. But what happened when misrule disappeared? Did societies lose a vital pressure valve, or did new customs take its place? That we will explore in our final section. The candles have burned low, the wassail is finished, and the last laugh of the Lord of Misrule echoes in memory. The 12 days are over. Winter presses on. The hearth is quiet again. But something lingers. A question, a memory, a hint of irreverence tucked beneath the stillness of tradition. For centuries, Christmas misrule offered people a chance to mock hierarchy, invert power, and live, if briefly, in a world turned upside down. It was play, yes, but it was also a kind of ritual commentary, a fleeting vision of how things might be different. So what happened to this world of reversal? Where did it go? And what traces remain in our lives today? In this final section, we explore the afterlife of medieval misrule. We'll examine how its spirit lived on in carnival, theater, holiday customs, and modern workplace culture. And we'll reflect on the deeper human need it served, one that perhaps we still crave. Carnival, misrule by another name. Even as Christmas misrule faded in the face of Reformation and rising bourgeois order, it resurfaced in new clothes at a different time of year. Carnival, celebrated in the weeks leading up to Lent, became the primary festival of reversal, license, and excess across Catholic Europe. From Venetian masks to Mardi Gras beads, Carnival preserved key features of medieval misrule. Mock kings and queens elected for the day. Role reversal, including cross-dressing and class parity. Public feasting, dancing and joking at the powerful's expense. Sacred and secular, blending in uneasy harmony. Though Carnival was not exclusive to Christmas, it functioned in a similar way: liminal time, where boundaries blurred, rules loosened, and identities shifted. In many ways, Carnival absorbed the energy of misrule and made it more theatrical, more flamboyant, and less religiously tied. But the heart was the same. People needed time outside the ordinary, a time not just to rest, but to laugh at their roles and rulers. From masquerade to modern office party. Fast forward to the present. You might not see a boy bishop preaching from the pulpit, or a servant crowned king in a manor hall, but you do see this. The holiday party, where junior staff mingle with executives and everyone wears novelty jumpers. The ugly sweater contest, a light form of self-parody. The office talent show, where roles reverse for entertainment. The temporary promotion of someone unexpected to MC or organize festivities. These customs, though often unconscious, echo the old patterns of misrule. Temporary elevation of the lowly. Role reversal within limits. Playful critique of status and authority. A sanctioned space for disorder just before the return to structure. It's not quite the revelry of a medieval hall, but the instinct remains. Even in children's traditions like pulling Christmas crackers, finding the king in a slice of cake, or singing cheeky verses of carols, the echo is there. We still mark time by bending its rules. The survival of the fool. One of misrule's most enduring legacies is the fool. In medieval courts, fools held a special place, allowed to say what others could not. In misrule, the fool became king. But over time, the fool became a symbol of truth-telling through humor. Today, that role persists in comedians, who often speak uncomfortable truths with laughter. Satirists, whose work challenges political or corporate power. Social media parodies, which lampoon hierarchy and trend. Holiday advertising, which uses humor to momentarily dissolve class boundaries. Even Santa drinks our soda. The fool has become embedded in culture, no longer just a role in a hall, but a genre, a voice, a lens. And that voice owes its existence, in part, to the centuries of seasonal misrule that legitimized it. Lessons from the upside-down world. So what can we learn from misrule? What relevance does it have in an age of digital calendars and online meetings? Perhaps this: role reversal humanizes. When a lord serves a servant or a bishop bows to a boy, the illusion of permanence in power is challenged. It reminds us that status is temporary and that humility is essential. Mockery can be medicine. Inversions provide relief, not just laughter, but perspective. By parodying the world, we reflect on it. Structure needs interruption. Just as silence gives music its shape, occasional disorder helps structure hold meaning. Misrule didn't destroy order, it refreshed it. Sacred time benefits from contrast. The joy of Christmas wasn't just in the feast, it was in the difference from ordinary days. Misrule deepened that contrast. Rebellion in ritual is safer than rebellion in blood. By giving people a controlled space for critique and silliness, society may have prevented more dangerous outbursts. These lessons are not dusty relics. They are blueprints for living with others, particularly in systems where roles and hierarchies persist. Final reflections: misrule in a world of permanence. In the medieval world, time was cyclical. There were seasons for fasting, seasons for feasting, days for work, days for worship. Misrule belonged to a pattern. Its madness was safe because it had boundaries. But in today's world, boundaries blur. We work through holidays. We celebrate on demand. We no longer have many communal moments of role reversal or shared absurdity. Maybe that's why nostalgia for old Christmas persists. Not because we want to return to dung floors and flickering candles, but because we miss the sense of time marked, of roles played, of joy earned through contrast. So perhaps there's still value in crowning the fool, letting the child speak, or allowing the janitor to run the Christmas raffle. These aren't meaningless gestures, they're tiny acts of humility, cracks in the structure through which light can shine. You extinguish the candle. The old garland is taken down. The floor is swept. But for a moment, just before ordinary life resumes, you remember, for 12 days the world was different. Not better, perhaps, but more human. And somewhere in the flicker of memory, the Lord of Misrule still laughs. Story 4: Wassail and Wardens, Drinking Traditions of Medieval Christmas. You are handed a heavy wooden mug, warm to the touch, filled with a steaming brew that smells faintly of apples, spices, and wood smoke. You raise it to your lips and hear a chorus of voices cry out, "Wassail!" The drink is thick and sweet, tinged with ale or cider, and it spreads warmth through your chest against the chill of the December air. This is not just a beverage. This is ritual. This is community. This is survival through celebration. In the medieval world, drinking at Christmas was more than merriment, it was a deeply embedded seasonal tradition. It shaped how people came together, how they shared their resources, how they expressed gratitude, and even how they warded off evil. At the heart of these customs was a single word: wassail. But what did it mean? Where did it come from? And how did drinking at Christmastide become such a powerful, enduring part of the season? Wees hail, a toast to health and survival. The word wassail has Old English roots: wees hail, meaning be in good health or be whole. It was originally a salutation, a spoken wish of wellness exchanged between friends, neighbors, or fellow travelers. By the early Middle Ages, it had become a ritual greeting at feasts, particularly during the dark midwinter months when health was precarious and community mattered most. Over time, it became closely tied to drinking traditions, especially at Christmastide. Wassailing was, at its core, an act of communal drinking paired with blessing. Wassail, one would say, raising a mug. Drink hail, came the reply, drink to your health. This wasn't a one-on-one exchange. It was choral, collective. In a cold, uncertain world, it was a verbal and physical gesture of solidarity. To drink together was to share strength, and to offer the cup was to offer protection. Wassail the drink, apple ale and spices. The drink itself wassail varied by region, and by what ingredients were available. The most common base was ale or cider, heated and mixed with roasted apples, creating a floating pulp called lamb's wool. Sugar or honey, for sweetness if affordable. Spices such as nutmeg, ginger, cinnamon, or cloves. Sometimes eggs or cream in wealthier households. The result was thick, warming, and mildly alcoholic, a drink designed to nourish as much as to delight. The roasted apples gave it body. The spices, often imported and expensive, added prestige, and the heat made it ideal for winter feasts and fireside gatherings. Wassail bowls were often large, communal vessels, wooden or metal, and passed from person to person in ritualized fashion. Drinking from the same bowl signified trust and unity. In some wealthier halls, the bowls were highly decorated, carved or engraved, and kept as family heirlooms. Wassailing the orchard, blessing the trees. Wassailing was not confined to the indoors. In parts of England, especially in cider-producing regions like Somerset, Herefordshire, and Devon, it took place outside, in the orchards themselves. Here how it worked. On Twelfth Night or Old Christmas Eve, January 5th, villagers gathered in the apple orchards. A large bowl of wassail was prepared and carried from tree to tree. The group would sing songs or chant rhymes to the trees, blessing them for a fruitful harvest in the year to come. Cider was poured on the roots or left as an offering. Toasted bread, soaked in the wassail, was placed in the branches, perhaps for the robins, or perhaps for the spirits of the trees themselves. In some cases, guns or pots were banged, or fires lit, to scare away evil spirits or malevolent forces. This blend of Christian blessing, folk custom, and agricultural ritual was a potent form of misrule and magic. It acknowledged the deep interdependence between people and the land. The trees needed care, but they also needed cheer. Drinking together, ale, mead, and social glue. While wassail was the ceremonial centerpiece, Christmas in medieval Europe was rich with other drinks, each tied to class, region, and availability. Ale, the most common drink made from barley or oats, usually weak and consumed by all ages, often brewed at home. Mead, a honey-based alcoholic drink, popular in Northern and Eastern Europe, associated with feasting and poetry. Wine, reserved mostly for the wealthy and clergy, often spiced and diluted, imported from warmer regions. Posset, a creamy custard-like drink made with hot milk and ale or wine, sometimes served as a dessert. Drinking at Christmas was not solely for intoxication. It was ceremonial and often structured. Each course of the feast might have its own accompanying drink. Toasts were given not casually but in order of rank, beginning with the lord or head of household. In monasteries, wine and ale were portioned according to rank and age. Even in spiritual settings, a bit of festive drink was allowed within limits. Importantly, drinking was a social event, a way to affirm bonds and status. To decline a drink might be seen as rude or antisocial. To offer someone your cup was a sign of honor. To sing while drinking was an act of unity, communal joy, expressed through ritual. Drunkenness, a risk and a reminder. While drinking was accepted, even encouraged at Christmas, it was not without danger. The church regularly preached against excess. Drunkenness was a sin, often tied to sloth, lust, or wrath, depending on its outcome. Sermons from the 12th to 15th centuries warned of what happened when Christmas cheer went too far. Brawls at feast, dishonor among servants, fights between rival parishes, disruption of sacred services. Yet the church also understood the need for festivity. The balance between joy and judgment was always delicate. And so a kind of seasonal leniency emerged. People were expected to drink but also expected to recover, confess, begin anew. The new year, after all, came shortly after the cup had emptied. Music and song, drinking in harmony. Wassailing wasn't silent. It was almost always accompanied by song. Some of the earliest Christmas carols were actually wassailing songs, verses meant to be sung door to door, in exchange for drink or food. These songs were call and response in nature, filled with toasts and blessings, joyful, rhythmic, and simple enough for communal singing. Examples include Here We Come a Wassailing, Gloucestershire Wassail, the Wassail Song. Many included verses that praised the household, requested hospitality, and jokingly threatened bad luck if turned away. These songs were part performance, part request, part prayer. They often blurred the line between begging and blessing, especially when performed by poor villagers or children. The household that welcomed wassailers was seen as generous. The one that did, well, the song might change in tone. But why so much drinking at Christmas? At its heart, medieval Christmas drinking was about resilience. Against the cold, against isolation, against the fear of winter's depths. Drinking together, especially from the same bowl, under the same roof, to the same song, was an act of resistance against despair. It offered temporary pleasure, yes, but more than that, it offered connection. And in a world of limited light and heavy burdens, that was worth toasting. Still, one wonders, how did these traditions change as society evolved? What happened to wassailing during the Reformation? How did drinking customs survive or get suppressed, and what do we carry forward today? The firelight flickers off the rim of the wassail bowl. Your fingers are sticky with honey, and the smell of roasted apples and nutmeg still clings to your sleeve. A child just sang a crooked verse at your door, and in return, you handed over a heel of bread and a sip of cider. But as the 16th century dawned, something began to change. The wassailers, once welcomed, were now sometimes turned away. The public drinking bowls were inspected by city officials. The singing was regulated, the revels shortened. And all across Europe, the church, newly splintered by the Protestant Reformation, began to question not just how people drank, but why they drank. This section follows the fortunes of Christmas drinking traditions through periods of reform, revival, and regulation. We'll trace how joy turned suspect, how communal customs became private, and how wassail survived, if only barely, into the modern age. The Reformation, when cheer became controversy. In the late 15th and early 16th centuries, the Reformation burst across Europe like cold water on a feast. Martin Luther, John Calvin, Huldrych Zwingli, and other Protestant reformers sought to purify Christian worship, removing what they saw as excess, error, or superstition. While their theological targets were often indulgences and ecclesiastical corruption, popular festivities including Christmas drinking came under scrutiny. What was once viewed as harmless holiday cheer now carried darker connotations. Wassailing was associated with paganism for its link to tree blessing and ritual. Public drunkenness was condemned as morally corrosive. Door-to-door singing for drink or food came to resemble begging or extortion. Excessive feasting and merriment were seen as distracting from spiritual reflection. In Calvinist Geneva, Christmas was not celebrated at all. In Puritan England, laws were passed that not only abolished Christmas observances during the mid-1600s, but also banned public celebrations, decorations, and drinking parties associated with the holiday. Even in more moderate Protestant regions, wassailers were increasingly unwelcome. Municipal records from 16th century German and Dutch towns include fines for loud songs and rude visits during the 12 days. In short, cheer became controversial. Alehouses and anxiety, policing the pint. During the Middle Ages, ale and beer were brewed at home or in monasteries. But by the late 15th century, Commercial alehouses and taverns had become widespread in urban areas. This brought new social dynamics. More people drinking in public, more mixing across class lines, more potential for crime, disorder, or sedition. Authorities began to regulate licensing of taverns, curfews on drinking hours, limits on serving to the poor or unemployed, restrictions on holiday gatherings in alehouses. Wassailing, once done with joy in the village green or orchard, began to feel suspicious in city streets. Still, rural traditions persisted, especially in regions less influenced by reformist zeal. In Western England, the wassail bowl continued to pass from house to house. Songs were still sung, trees still received their cider offerings. But increasingly, the practice retreated from public life. What had been open-air ritual became private festivity. Revival and resistance, the wassailers endure. Despite attempts to suppress them, Christmas drinking customs did not vanish. They hid, changed shape, and sometimes even reclaimed favor. In Anglican England, following the Restoration in 1660, traditional Christmas customs were revived. The monarchy promoted holiday celebration as a form of social stability, and that included ale, song, and ceremony. The wassail song returned to drawing rooms, now sanitized and printed in carol books. Recipes for wassail drinks appeared in domestic manuals, often emphasizing their medicinal qualities, warming the body, fighting colds, calming the nerves. By the 18th century, wassail had become nostalgic, a reminder of merry oldie England. Poets and antiquarians began writing about its lost charms. Robert Herrick praised the wassail bowl in his 1648 collection Hesperides. Washington Irving described Old English Christmases with roaring fires and bowls of punch in his 1820 sketchbook, helping to spark the Victorian revival. Yet even in revival, drinking customs were reshaped. Now largely domestic and symbolic, wassail was more often a recipe than a ritual. Still, in scattered villages, the old ways never truly vanished. In Devon or Somerset, you could still find men and women on Twelfth Night, singing to trees and pouring cider on the roots. You still can. The Victorian temperance movement, a final blow. By the 19th century, a new threat to holiday drinking emerged, not from theology, but from social reform. The temperance movement, driven by concerns about alcoholism, family violence, and poverty, sought to reduce or eliminate alcohol consumption across society. Though rooted in genuine humanitarian concern, it often took aim at holiday excesses. Christmas, with its associations of drinking and feasting, became a battleground. Reformers promoted teetotal holiday gatherings, temperance wassail recipes using apple juice, spices, and no alcohol, children's caroling events as alternatives to adult revels, dry Christmas services with moral instruction replacing mirth. At the same time, middle-class domestic ideals reshaped the image of Christmas. No longer a rowdy, public festival, it became a family-centered occasion, focused on gifts, tree decorating, and sentimental rituals, lit by candles or gas lamps, not alehouse torches. In this world, the wassailers had no place. Yet even the Victorians could not fully erase the pull of shared drink, warmth, and song. The punch bowl lingered on many holiday tables. Recipes for spiced cider and mulled wine appeared in every cookbook. And in literature, Dickens, A Christmas Carol, for example, drink remained a symbol of hospitality, forgiveness, and human kindness. Survival in song and ceremony. By the 20th century, medieval drinking customs had become folklore. Few practiced them, but many sang about them. The carol "Here We Come A-Wassailing," first published in the 19th century, entered popular music. Its lyrics preserve the form. Love and joy come to you, and to you your wassail too. And God bless you and send you A happy new year. Even those who had never passed a bowl or poured cider on a tree knew the tune. The tradition had passed into cultural memory. In recent decades, folk revival movements and historical reenactments have brought some of these customs back to life, at least in performance. Morris dancers accompany wassail ceremonies in English villages. Orchard wassailing events draw tourists and locals alike in January. Historic sites stage old-fashioned Christmases with recipes for authentic wassail drinks. Wassail, once a living tradition of winter blessing and communal resilience, has become part history, part heritage, part theater. But it still warms the throat, still evokes memory, still offers connection. Why did it matter so much? Why did people cling to these drinking customs for so long? Why do fragments still survive? Because drinking at Christmas was never about alcohol alone. It was about connection, joining neighbors, sharing burdens, celebrating survival. Blessing, wishing others health, happiness, and abundance. Memory, marking sacred time with ritual and taste. Defiance, laughing in the face of winter's cold and hardship. In a world without central heating, without supermarkets, without digital distractions, a warm drink meant something. It meant safety, hope, being seen. But the story's not quite over. How did these customs adapt as they moved across oceans into new colonies, new religions, and modern commercial culture? What became of the communal bowl in an individualist world? The wassail bowl is long gone, the orchard is quiet, the singing has stopped. But in your hand, perhaps, is a mug of something warm. The scent of spice, a hint of apple or cinnamon, floats up. The lights twinkle, someone toasts, laughter rises. It may not be called wassailing, and no one pours cider at the roots of a tree, but something ancient persists in this act. This final section explores the modern echoes of medieval Christmas drinking traditions. It traces how wassail crossed oceans, how rituals adapted, and how, in surprising ways, we still raise our cups to the same winter gods of warmth, fellowship, and endurance. The transatlantic journey of wassail. As English, Welsh, and Scottish colonists spread to the Americas, so too did their holiday customs. But colonial life, especially in the 17th and 18th centuries, demanded adaptation. The New England Puritans rejected Christmas entirely as a popish and pagan invention. In fact, celebrating Christmas was banned in Massachusetts from 1659 to 1681. In Virginia and the southern colonies, Christmas retained more of its English character. Feasting, drinking, and visiting were common. Here, the wassail tradition found a place, especially among the gentry. By the 18th century, American cookbooks and diaries mention wassail recipes, often simplified. Cider or ale, sugar or molasses, cinnamon and nutmeg, sometimes eggs or cream, creating a foamy version similar to modern eggnog. Though the ritual elements of orchard blessing or door-to-door songs faded, the drink itself survived, changing shape with the times. Eggnog, often fortified with rum or brandy, became the preferred winter drink in many parts of North America. And like wassail, it was communal, seasonal, and meant to be shared. Victorian sentiment and the rise of Christmas punch. In the 19th century, especially during the Victorian Christmas revival, old customs were revived in a gentler, more sentimental form. Charles Dickens' A Christmas Carol played a central role in shaping the modern idea of Christmas as a season of family warmth, redemption, generosity, feasting, and toast. Within this cultural revival, drinking bowls, now often called punch bowls, regained popularity. Middle-class parlors featured ornate punch sets during Christmas gatherings. The drinks ranged from mulled wine to sherry cobbler to eggnog, depending on taste and wealth. The old communal aspect persisted. The bowl was shared. The drinks were served with ceremony. Toasts were given to absent friends, the new year, and the health of the household. In literature and illustrations of the time, it's common to see rosy-cheeked guests clinking glasses, often with a wassail, cheer even if they didn't know where the word came from. The spirit lived on, a drink to welcome, to warm, and to wish well. Christmas carols and the memory of the bowl. Even as the ritual of wassailing faded, the songs survived. Traditional English carols preserved the language and rhythm of medieval drinking culture. The wassail song. Here we come a-wassailing. The Gloucestershire wassail. These songs typically followed a structure of approach, we are not daily beggars. Praise, God bless the master of this house. Request, pray give us some figgy pudding. Farewell, we wish you a Merry Christmas. Even though the songs are now performed in sanitized, often children's formats, their origins were adult, earthy, and community-driven. To sing them was to remind others of their duty to share. The implied message, give cheer or else be known for stinginess. The songs remain not just in choirs and Christmas albums, but in commercials, sitcoms, and school performances. They are fragments of a much older world still sung, still remembered. The wassail spirit in modern customs. You may not call it wassailing, but you've likely participated in its spiritual descendants. Holiday open houses, where drinks are shared freely with guests. Office parties, with ceremonial toasts and communal bowls of punch. Caroling, sometimes with a thermos of cider or mulled wine in hand. Christmas markets, serving spiced beverages in paper cups. Even the act of clinking glasses and saying, cheers, carries the essence of the old wassail drinkale exchange. And in some corners of the world, the old customs are actively preserved. In parts of southwest England, orchard wassailing still occurs each January, with processions, cider offerings, and blessing songs. Folk festivals across Britain, Australia, and the U.S. include revival wassail events, complete with traditional recipes, costumes, and music. Heritage cider producers have embraced the custom as part of their brand, offering wassail nights to the public. In these ways, tradition becomes tourism but also transmission, a way to keep the past near, even in changed form. Recipes for remembering. Even the drinks themselves are memory maps. A simple cup of mulled cider or wine links you to 1,000 winters past. Every ingredient tells a story. Apple, a nod to orchard rituals and seasonal abundance. Cinnamon and cloves, once rare, expensive symbols of generosity. Honey or sugar, sweetness as blessing, not indulgence. Heat, life in cold months, warmth as a gift. To make a wassail drink today is not just a culinary choice, it's a quiet act of reconnection. Wassailing in a fragmented age. In a time when digital connection is easy, but emotional connection often lacking, the spirit of wassail feels almost radical. The medieval wassail bowl wasn't just a drink, it was a ritual object, passed hand to hand, mouth to mouth, a literal sharing of warmth and health. It required presence, touch, and trust. We now live in a world of individual cups, disposable containers, and pre-packaged everything. Even our toasts are often ironic or rushed. But in choosing to gather, to raise a glass, to offer someone something warm, we recreate something ancient. We reject isolation. We reclaim hospitality as heritage. Wassailing reminds us that Christmas, at its core, is about togetherness, even when food is scarce, even when the world outside is hard and cold. A final reflection, what is left in the bowl? The wassailers have gone home, the bowl is empty, the fire crackles low. But the memory remains. Of a drink passed freely, of a song sung in frost, of a tree blessed for fruit not yet grown, of strangers welcomed, of health wished, of joy not bought but made. In a world that often asks us to consume, wassail invites us to commune. So this Christmas, whether with spiced cider, mulled wine, or a humble cup of tea, raise it high. Say the old word, pass the warmth. Wassail. Story 5, Mumming and Misrule. The curious case of Christmas entertainment. It's a cold night. The fire burns low in the manor hearth. The feast has ended and the guests sit in silence, drowsy with meat and mead. Then, without warning, a loud knock rattles the door. No one moves. A second knock, louder, faster. The steward stands and opens it. In rush a group of figures, loud and strange, their faces hidden behind cloth masks or painted in grotesque colors. One wears a tall headdress made from feathers. Another drags a wooden sword. A third is dressed as a woman poorly. These are not intruders, they are mummers. The guests cheer, the fire flares, and the Christmas night takes a turn for the strange. In the medieval world, Christmas was not only about food, song, and prayer. It was also a time for performance, often improvised, often chaotic, and always laced with meaning disguised as nonsense. This is the world of mumming, a peculiar and ancient form of Christmas entertainment. Equal parts theater, game, and social ritual, mumming was how the season came alive in movement, masks, and misrule. What was mumming? Mumming was a type of folk performance traditionally done during the Christmas season, especially on or around the 12 days of Christmas. It varied widely across regions, but generally included the following elements. Disguise. The performers wore masks, veils, or painted faces to conceal their identity. Door-to-door visits. Like carolers or wassailers, mummers moved through towns and villages. Play acting. A short, often farcical play was performed in the hall, yard, or street. Mock combat. Sword fights were common, usually between a hero and a villain. Death and revival. A character would die, only to be magically brought back to life. Laughter. Mumming was deeply comedic, often bawdy, occasionally crude, and filled with inside jokes, local satire, and slapstick antics. Mummers were usually rewarded with food, drink, or small coins for their performance. They were a form of unsanctioned entertainment, unpredictable and always hovering between delight and disruption. They were not official minstrels or trained players. They were ordinary folk, seizing the one season of the year when the world allowed no, expected the absurd. Where did mumming come from? The origins of mumming are tangled, with roots likely stretching back into pagan midwinter rituals, Roman Saturnalia, and Anglo-Saxon customs. The word mummer is believed to derive from the Old French momer, meaning to mask or to mutter. In ancient Roman Saturnalia, role reversal, masked processions, and theatrical games were common practices that likely evolved into medieval forms of communal performance. Early references to mumming in England appear as early as the 14th century. In London records from the reign of Edward III, mummers are noted as causing disturbances during the 12 days, some even arrested for entering homes uninvited, wearing masks, and carrying weapons. But despite the church and civic authorities occasionally condemning the practice, mumming endured because it met a need no official ritual could fill. It allowed for anonymous social critique, escapism through laughter, community cohesion through shared absurdity, symbolic storytelling rooted in survival and resurrection. The plot thickens, common characters and structure. Though regional variations abounded, many mummers' plays followed a loose formula, a miniature morality play disguised as comedy. Common characters included St. George, a heroic figure who battles evil. The Turkish knight, often his opponent representing the other. The doctor, who miraculously revives the dead. The fool, a trickster who may also act as narrator or comic relief. Beelzebub, a devilish figure with mischief in mind. A female character, usually played by a man for comic effect. A typical mumming play might go like this. Entrance, the mummers arrive, uninvited but welcomed. Boast, the hero declares his strength and virtue. Challenge, the villain enters, mocks the hero and challenges him. Combat, a theatrical sword fight ends in death. Lament, the other characters cry out who can save the slain. Resurrection, the doctor enters, delivering nonsense lines and absurd cures, and revives the fallen. Dance or song, the play ends with merriment. While absurd, the plot held deeper symbolic meanings. Death and rebirth, light overcoming darkness. Community healing through laughter and shared ritual. At a time when real sickness, death, and scarcity loomed, this comic play acting of tragedy and recovery was a kind of therapy. Why Christmas? Why then? The 12 days of Christmas were a time outside ordinary time. The agricultural year had paused. The church calendar had shifted into festivity. Social norms loosened. Darkness and cold were at their peak. Mumming fit perfectly into this season of inversion and ambiguity. Like the Lord of Misrule, the Boy Bishop, and the Wassailers, the mummers belonged to the liminal zone, neither fully sacred nor profane, neither performance nor prayer, but something in between. They brought chaos into the hall, but it was a structured chaos, expected and ultimately safe. They mocked their hosts, but only because their hosts allowed it. And they disappeared just as quickly as they came. Mumming in castles and cottages alike. Mumming was not confined to the peasantry. In royal and noble courts, especially during the later Middle Ages and Tudor period, mummer-like entertainments were staged as part of grand feasts. Guests wore elaborate disguises and performed mini plays. Nobles entered masked, danced, or delivered humorous speeches. Theatrical pageants with allegorical themes, love, virtue, vice, were presented. At the court of Henry VIII, mumming became a formalized entertainment, sometimes involving hundreds of players, dancers, and musicians. Disguised balls and masks became fashionable, though they were far more choreographed than their rustic cousins. Yet the core idea remained: performance, masking, and release from ordinary roles. Even in royal halls, misrule had its moment. But were the mummers always welcome? Not always. Because mummers operated outside formal structure, they occasionally provoked concern. Church leaders worried that the disguises encouraged sin or heresy. City officials feared that mumming could be used to conceal crime or spread sedition. Moralists disliked the cross-dressing, crudeness, and irreverence. In some towns, especially after the Reformation, laws were passed banning mumming or requiring performers to register, unmask, or limit their appearances. Yet, like many Christmas traditions, mumming survived because it served a deeper communal purpose. It was a mirror and a mask, a joke and a blessing, a sword and a song. But how did mumming change in the modern era? What became of these wandering masked fools? And do they still walk among us even now? The laughter is fading. The sword fight is done. The doctor has revived the slain knight with a nonsense chant and a pinch of snuff, and the fool has begun a jig that's half dance, half collapse. The audience, half drunk, wholly delighted, tosses coins into a cap. Then, just as suddenly as they came, the mummers are gone, vanishing into the snow-covered night. But the memory lingers, the laughter, the satire, the oddity. In this section, we trace the path of the mummers as they move into the modern world. What happened when their ancient forms collided with reformist morality, urban regulation, and modern entertainment? What do we lose when impromptu performance becomes polished stagecraft or disappears entirely? And just as importantly, what do we keep? The Reformation and the retreat of the mummers. As the Protestant Reformation spread across Europe in the 16th century, many festive customs rooted in folk ritual were targeted. Mumming, with its elements of disguise, cross-dressing, bawdy humor, and parody of sacred figures, was no exception. In England, Scotland, and parts of Germany, clergy condemned mummers, plays as profane entertainments. Civil authorities began to see masked revelers as potential threats to public order. Laws were passed limiting or outright banning masked performances, especially those with religious parody. This didn't immediately end mumming, especially in rural areas where oral tradition was strong and enforcement was weak. But the tide had turned. In urban centers, mumming grew less common. In courts and elite households, controlled theatrical masks replaced spontaneous performances. In some regions, elements of mumming were absorbed into church-approved pageants, stripped of satire and sanitized for didactic use. By the 17th century, in many parts of Europe, public mumming had receded from sight, surviving mainly in villages and remote parishes. Survival in the shadows, folk persistence in rural communities. Yet mumming never vanished entirely. In England, the West Country, the North, and parts of Wales and Scotland maintained local versions of the mummers, play well into the 19th century. In these communities, Christmas or New Year's Eve remained the preferred time for performances. Troops of locals, often farm laborers or tradesmen, memorized traditional scripts passed down orally. Characters like St. George, the Turkish knight Beelzebub, and the doctor remained central. Performances were done in homes, barns, inns, or outside in the village square. Often, these plays parodied local events, featured jokes about known individuals, and included nonsense verse designed to confuse or amuse. The costumes were crude but effective: sheets, soot, ribbons, paper hats, and the performances were rough, unrehearsed, and unpolished. In these moments, the medieval spirit of misrule endured. There was no ticket price, no director, no written program, just players and audience improvising their way through winter. The Victorian rediscovery, from folk art to antiquarian treasure. In the 19th century, Britain experienced a surge in interest in the old ways. As industrialization changed landscapes and lifestyles, writers and antiquarians began to document disappearing customs, including mumming. Key figures in this rediscovery included William Sandys, who collected carols and mentions of mummers, plays in the 1830s. Charlotte Byrne, a folklorist who detailed regional variations. Thomas Hardy, whose novels contain references to rustic plays and local entertainments. Sabine Baring-Goode, who wrote extensively about folk traditions in Devon and Cornwall. At the same time, Victorian Christmas itself was being reimagined less as a season of misrule and more as a time of family, warmth, and controlled festivity. Mumming, once seen as rough and rude, was reframed as quaint, picturesque, and historic. Plays were transcribed and printed, adapted for school pageants and village entertainments, occasionally rewritten to remove offensive or bawdy content. While this saved many mummers' plays from extinction, it also froze them in time, turning living traditions into museum pieces. Mumming across the sea, new lives in the New World. Elements of mumming crossed the Atlantic with British and Irish settlers. In Newfoundland and Labrador, mummers' traditions took on a distinct life. Known locally as mummering or jannying, people dressed in outlandish costumes and visited homes during the 12 days of Christmas. The goal was to remain unrecognized. If the host guessed correctly, the mummer would reveal themselves. If not, they stayed in disguise. Music, dance, and jokes followed, and the mummers were offered drink or cake. Sometimes mummers entered homes uninvited, and the line between fun and discomfort blurred. By the mid-20th century, mummering faced criticism, especially after a violent incident in the 1860s, and was eventually discouraged. But in the 1980s, it was revived as part of Newfoundland's cultural heritage, complete with a mummers parade, educational programs, costume-making workshops, In this way, mumming remained alive, not just as reenactment but as community expression. Modern theater, pantomime, and the legacy of mumming. Meanwhile, in Britain, theatrical traditions influenced by mumming evolved into more structured forms of seasonal entertainment. Chief among them was the rise of the Christmas pantomime. Originating in the 18th century, pantomime, or panto, became a staple of British holiday culture. Though loosely based on classical stories or fairy tales, panto retained key elements of mumming. Cross-dressing, the dame played by a man, the principal boy played by a woman. Audience participation, he's behind you. Moral conflict, good versus evil with comic exaggeration. Topical humor and local references. Pantomime offered a commercial, polished descendant of the rough village mummers play, adapted for the stage but echoing the same structures of inversion, disguise, and comic confrontation. Though now more glitzy than gritty, panto is a living remnant of medieval misrule, repackaged for modern family audiences. The meaning beneath the mask. At its core, mumming, like all seasonal performance, is about more than entertainment. It's about ritualized storytelling. Why did every play end with resurrection? Why did the doctor's cures make no sense? Why did characters wear masks or switch gender? Because these stories gave shape to deep, wordless anxieties. Winter might not end. Loved ones might not return. Illness might not be cured. The world might not make sense. Mumming played with these fears not by denying them, but by mocking them. And in that mockery, power was reclaimed. To see the dead rise, to see the fool laugh, to see the doctor cure with gibberish, it was to say, we know the darkness, but we will dance anyway. Yet as mumming faded from daily life, what replaced it? Did its spirit migrate into sitcoms, parades, holiday specials? Is there still a need for comic chaos in sacred time? To answer that, we must look at mumming's contemporary revival and the question of whether tradition can survive as memory or must be reinvented to live again. The old play is done. The fire is cold. The characters St. George, the Turkish knight, Beelzebub, the fool have faded into history books and local memories. Or have they? In this final section, we look at how mumming has been revived, reimagined, and repurposed in the modern era. From local festivals and heritage projects to political street theater and community art, the mummers haven't disappeared, they've adapted. What began as rustic Christmas misrule has become something larger, a model of ritual performance, deeply human and surprisingly flexible. It still offers us something essential, especially in a world that often feels impersonal and fragmented. Modern revivals, mummers march again. Starting in the late 20th century, folklorists, artists, and heritage groups across the UK and North America began to actively revive mummers' plays, not just as static reenactments, but as living rituals. Key examples include United Kingdom, England. Padstow, Cornwall, hosts a revived Old Christmas Day mummers play with traditional characters and music. South Yorkshire, the Peace Egg play continues, with performers visiting pubs and homes during the Christmas season. London, the Lambeth Mummers and other urban groups perform in parks and city squares, sometimes adding modern commentary to traditional plots. In these revivals, scripts are based on oral versions collected in the 19th century. Costumes reflect local traditions: paper hats, rag coats, soot-blackened faces, now being reconsidered and updated. Audiences are invited to participate, restoring the improvisational energy of earlier times. These aren't just folk museum pieces, they are community expressions of continuity. North America, the Newfoundland model. In Canada, particularly Newfoundland and Labrador, mummering has been not just revived, but celebrated as a defining feature of local identity. Since 2009, The Mummers Festival in St. John's has included a citywide Mummers Parade with hundreds in homemade costumes, workshops on mummering history, storytelling, and costume creation, public discussions about the trickiness of disguise, anonymity, and cultural memory. Here, mumming is both performance and education, a way to pass down regional history, reclaim public space, and engage with questions of tradition and change. It's not just nostalgia, it's living heritage. Urban mumming, from village jest to street theater. In the last few decades, the mumming framework has also inspired political street theater and community arts. Activist troupes use masked performance and comic confrontation in protests, echoing mumming's role in satirizing authority. Some community theater projects adapt mummers, plays to comment on climate change, gentrification, or public health. Educational programs use the mummers, play model in schools to teach literacy, performance, and local history. These examples return to mumming's oldest function, using absurd performance to speak serious truths. Even if St. George becomes Nurse George and the Turkish knight becomes Landlord Knight, the core remains: conflict, comedy, death, resurrection, and resolution. What mumming still offers. Mumming may seem quaint or bizarre, but its core functions remain relevant, especially today. One ritual in an unritual age. Modern life is often disconnected from seasonal rhythm. Mumming provides a chance to mark time, to enact a midwinter drama, and to bring people together in shared experience. 2. Community performance. In a world of screens, passive entertainment, and social media, mumming insists on liveness. You must show up. You must play a part. You must laugh with others. 3. Playful subversion. Mumming allows for temporary inversion of roles, power, norms. It lets us question structures through comedy, not confrontation. 4. Embodied storytelling. It reconnects us to oral tradition, physical space, and improvised creativity, things often lost in scripted, edited digital formats. Can mumming survive the digital age? That depends on what we do with it. If preserved only as antique folklore, mumming may fade. But if allowed to change, to speak to present needs, it will endure as it always has. Already, we see signs of mumming in modern forms. Flash mobs using costumes and mock battles. Satirical YouTube sketches mimicking community archetypes. Improvised comedy troupes using folklore templates. Interactive gaming and LARPing, which mirror ritual play in structured time. Mumming doesn't have to be ancient. It can be local, playful, and now. A final toast to the fool. So what do we take from all this? That somewhere on a quiet night in late December, someone might knock on your door not with a package but with a joke, not asking for money but offering a play, not looking for likes but for laughter. And in that moment, you glimpse a world where roles are reversed, rules are relaxed, community is celebrated, and the darkest season makes space for joy. That is mumming. That is Christmas misrule. That is the human need to laugh at death and sing in the cold and dance in a mask, not to hide but to belong. So next time you hear a knock at the door, listen carefully. It just might be the mummers. Story 6. The Feast Before the Fast, Christmas and the Medieval Food Economy. It is December in a medieval village. The sun, when it rises, hangs low in the sky. The wind cuts through woolen cloaks and the ground is hard with frost. Inside a timbered hall, a fire crackles. Bread bakes slowly in a clay oven. In the corner, someone is plucking a bird, likely a goose, not a turkey. There is no feast yet, but there will be. To understand a medieval Christmas, one must begin not with the celebration, but with the preparation, with the labor, planning, and quiet calculation that preceded even the most modest seasonal indulgence. Because unlike today, there was no grocery store. There was no last-minute shopping run. Every bite of food on the table was earned with forethought and often a little risk. In this section, we explore how ordinary people in medieval Europe prepared for the Christmas feast, what they ate, how they got it, and why the act of feasting mattered so deeply in a world so often defined by hunger. A season of scarcity. To begin, remember this: December was not a time of plenty. In the agricultural calendar, winter was a season of waiting, of surviving on what had been preserved, slaughtered, or stored. Fresh vegetables were scarce. Fruits were dried or absent entirely. Grains had to last until the next harvest, which could be many months away. This made the Christmas feast a paradox. It was a moment of abundance in a time of leanness, and that contrast gave it power. To feast in December was to declare boldly, "We have survived so far, we will keep surviving." But to do that, people had to plan early. In fact, preparations for Christmas food often began in late summer or autumn. Preserving the harvest. Preservation wasn't just sensible, it was essential. Here are some of the ways food was prepared for winter. Salting and smoking. Meat, especially pork and fish, was salted or smoked in late autumn. Bacon was a staple. Drying. Beans, peas, lentils, apples, and herbs were dried and stored in sacks or hanging bundles. Pickling and brining. Eggs, cabbage, as in early forms of sauerkraut, and even fruits were preserved in brine. Ale and mead. Brewing was done in autumn so that drink would be ready by December. Ale went sour quickly, so it was drunk fresh and often. Cheese and butter. These were made during summer and stored, though butter especially was tricky to keep. Peasants rarely had access to exotic spices or refined sugar, but they had garlic, mustard, vinegar, and honey. These, along with salt, helped flavor preserved food, making even lean meals palatable. In wealthier households, imported items like cinnamon, cloves, ginger, and pepper might be used sparingly at Christmas, signaling wealth and piety through seasonal indulgence. The slaughter month, blood month, and winter butchery. November was traditionally the time for slaughtering livestock. There were practical reasons for this. Grazing animals couldn't feed easily in frozen fields. Farmers couldn't afford to feed large herds from their stored grain. Cold temperatures allowed meat to keep longer without spoiling. In Anglo-Saxon England, November was called Blotmanath, or blood month, referring to this time of slaughter and sacrifice. The animals killed were usually pigs, the primary source of meat for most people. Salted pork, hams, and sausages were made. Cattle, less often, as they were more valuable alive, but older animals were sometimes butchered. Geese or chickens, eaten fresh or preserved. Fish, smoked or salted, especially important for fasting days. This period of butchery meant that December offered the last chance to eat fresh meat before it was salted, smoked, or gone entirely. The Christmas table, then, was the culmination of months of effort, planning, and preservation. It was not routine, it was reward. Foraging, gleaning, and quiet preparation. Not all Christmas food came from domestic stores. Peasants and villagers also relied on foraging, nuts, mushrooms, berries, and wild herbs. Gleaning, gathering leftover grain from harvested fields, a practice often protected by law for the poor. Gardens, turnips, leeks, onions, and cabbage might survive into early winter. Dairy. Some villages had communal dairy cows that continued to produce milk through December. The rhythm of daily labor slowed in winter, but there was always something to do. Wood had to be gathered for cooking fires. Brewing had to be watched. Bread had to be baked in the village oven, which was sometimes shared among households. In monastic communities, such work was done with deliberate intention, often as a spiritual act. Preparing food was part of the Advent season, a time of fasting and prayer before Christmas. For the poor, preparation was more practical but no less sacred. Even small gatherings required thought, negotiation, and hope. The role of the manor and the church. For peasants living under the manorial system, Christmas preparation was also shaped by lords and clergy. On some estates, the lord's household hosted a Christmas feast for tenants or workers, more symbolic than generous, but still memorable. Tithes of grain, meat, or ale might be paid to the church before Christmas, which sometimes redistributed them during feast days. Almsgiving increased during the season. Leftover food, bread or drink, was shared with beggars and widows. In this way, Christmas was also a time when the social order softened, if briefly. The powerful demonstrated charity, the poor received hospitality, and the church served as both host and moral compass. What was actually eaten? What did a medieval Christmas table include? For a peasant family, brown bread made from rye, barley, or oats, a pottage of legumes or root vegetables, flavored with onion or garlic, salted meat, likely pork, maybe a roasted bird, goose, or chicken, ale or weak beer, a sweet treat, honeyed nuts, dried fruit, or a cake made from grain and lard. For a wealthier household or monastery, white bread or wheat, roast meats, beef, venison, pork, or goose, a meat pie or game stew, fish dishes, especially if the feast fell on a fasting day, spiced wine or mead, elaborate dishes with sugar, almonds, or dried fruit, a symbolic food like a boar's head, often paraded in with ceremony. Regardless of wealth, the Christmas meal was larger, warmer, and richer than normal. It was not excess, it was exception. The feast as community and calendar. Feasting at Christmas was not simply a meal. It was a marker in the year, a pause between hard seasons, a moment of reflection and reassurance. In villages, it gathered neighbors together and shared survival. In castles, it reaffirmed hierarchy and order. In monasteries, it reminded monks of the sacredness of hospitality. In all places, it answered a single deep hunger, not just for food, but for connection, celebration, and endurance. The feast was not the opposite of famine, it was the answer to it. And even for those with little, the act of setting aside the best for Christmas gave meaning to the labor of the year. An unfinished table. So as we imagine the hearth warm and the bread sliced, we must also remember the hidden labor behind the medieval Christmas meal. The woman who salted pork in October, the child who gleaned barley from a picked field, the brewer who measured grain in the dark, the monk who stirred pottage before morning prayers, the family who saved their only goose for one shared day. Each played a part in making Christmas not only possible but significant. And yet this is only the beginning, because even the best-laid feasts faced rules, restrictions, and religious boundaries. What happened when Christmas collided with fast days, when indulgence met piety, when appetite was regulated not by scarcity, but by sin? That story lies in the next course. The table is set. A loaf of bread rests beside a bowl of pottage. A roasted bird gleams with its own oils. There is ale, maybe some cheese, and even a dish sweetened with dried fruit and honey. It looks like a feast. But what day is it? Because if it's December 24th, or any day designated as a fast or vigil in the church calendar, everything might change. In the medieval world, food was not just seasonal or social, it was spiritual. What could be eaten, when it could be eaten, and how it was prepared were all shaped by the rhythms of the liturgical year. And Christmas, ironically, one of the most celebratory holidays, sat at the crossroads of indulgence and abstinence. In this section, we explore how medieval Christians navigated the complex intersection of feasting and fasting during the Christmas season, the theological rules, the clever culinary workarounds, and the moral tension between joy and restraint. Advent, a season of waiting and fasting. Before the Christmas feast came Advent, a time of spiritual preparation, lasting roughly 4 weeks. Today, Advent is often marked with candles, calendars, and reflection. But in the Middle Ages, it was observed with fasting, prayer and penance. Meat, eggs, and dairy were generally forbidden during Advent, especially for monks and the devout. In some regions, fish was permitted, as it was not considered flesh. Meals were fewer, often just one per day, during stricter observances. Even marriages and celebrations were discouraged. This made the approach to Christmas complex. On the one hand, it was a time of joy and preparation. On the other, it was a penitential season, similar in tone to Lent. So while Christmas Day itself was exempt feasting, was allowed, the days leading up to it were austere. This meant that the first bite of roast meat or creamy pottage on Christmas was not just pleasurable, it was liberating. The Vigil of Christmas, a strict fast before the feast. In many places, December 24th or Christmas Eve was a particularly strict fast day called a vigil. On vigils, no meat was eaten. No dairy or eggs were permitted. Meals were limited to one, typically eaten in the evening. This meant that Christmas morning was the true beginning of indulgence after weeks of restriction. The anticipation made the feast feel earned, a physical reflection of spiritual renewal. In noble households and monasteries, the transition from fast to feast was carefully choreographed. Midnight Mass might be followed by a light meal, or nativity bread, before the more substantial feast of the next day. For peasants who may have already been living on thin rations, the lines were blurrier. Still, many adhered to local religious customs, even if in modest ways. Feasting without flesh, clever cuisine for fast days. So what did people eat during fast days, especially when they still wanted to mark the season? Medieval cooks developed a rich tradition of mock, or fast-friendly foods, many of which were surprisingly creative. Fish in disguise. Ground fish meat was molded and spiced to resemble sausages or even roasts. Almond milk, used in place of dairy, made by soaking and grinding almonds. It thickened sauces and was a staple in wealthier kitchens. Rice or grain puddings, sweetened with honey or fruit but made without eggs or butter. Wafers and flatbreads, served with pottage or stewed vegetables. Fruit stewed in wine, dried figs, prunes, or dates cooked in spiced wine as dessert. Eel, common and highly prized. Especially during fasts it was considered fish, but had a rich, meaty texture. In monasteries and elite homes, fast day meals could still be elaborate, even if compliant. The appearance of restraint often masked great expense and effort. The moral ambiguity of feast day exceptions. The rules were clear, but the enforcement was often flexible. Wealthier households sometimes obtained papal dispensations to eat meat during Advent or on vigils. Some nobles simply bent the rules, especially in regions where local bishops were lenient. Monasteries found creative loopholes such as classifying beaver as a fish due to its aquatic habitat, a real historical debate. On some feast days of saints during Advent, temporary relaxations were permitted, adding layers of complexity. This led to tensions between spiritual ideals and culinary realities. Church sermons of the period frequently warned against overindulgence, feasting inappropriately on holy days, hypocrisy celebrating Christ's birth with gluttony. Yet even those warnings acknowledged that food and celebration were deeply human responses to sacred time. Christmas feasting as theological statement. When the feast finally came on Christmas Day, it was more than just a meal. It was a theological declaration. That joy could follow penance. That the incarnation deserved celebration. That the body, not just the soul, mattered. In this sense, the Christmas feast was liturgical, even if informal. It reflected the rhythm of Christian life. Preparation, Advent. Anticipation, Christmas Eve. Rejoicing, Christmas Day and beyond. For this reason, many households extended the feast into the 12 days of Christmas, culminating in Epiphany, January 6th. These days often included smaller meals, music, and visiting, but remained lighter than the central feast. Feasting and fasting in balance. The genius of the medieval food calendar lay not in its rigidity, but in its balance. People knew when to feast, when to fast, when to give, when to save. This created a rhythm that mirrored the agricultural year, social structures, and spiritual beliefs. Even for peasants who lived close to the edge of subsistence, the cycle of restraint and release offered psychological stability. There was always a next feast. There was always a future moment of celebration to work toward. And in that rhythm, the ordinary became sacred. The tensions of piety and pleasure. Still, the tension was never fully resolved. Moralists fretted about too much eating on feast days, too much feasting during religious seasons, confusion between sacred and secular customs. Yet despite these warnings, people continued to celebrate. Christmas was one of the few days in the year when even the poor might taste meat, drink ale, or eat something sweet. And if that meant stretching the rules a little, well, isn't the incarnation worth a feast? The medieval world knew how to balance rules and joy, restraint and release. But beyond what people ate or avoided, there was another dimension to the Christmas feast: who got to eat and who gave what to whom. Because food wasn't just about survival or celebration. It was about generosity, power, and obligation. And the gift of food, whether from a lord to a peasant or a neighbor to a widow, spoke volumes about how medieval society was stitched together. We'll explore that in the final course. In the smoky great hall of a manor, the tables groan under the weight of platters, roasted meats, fresh bread, tankards of ale. In the village nearby, a family shares a simple meal, perhaps their only fresh goose of the year, while a neighbor brings over a dish of lentils and cabbage, steaming from the hearth. The feast of Christmas in the Middle Ages was not only about eating, it was about exchange. Not in the commercial sense we know today, but in the older, deeper sense of gift-giving, hospitality, and social obligation. Food was a medium through which people expressed hierarchy, generosity, piety, and community. In this final section of Story 6, we explore how food moved between hands during Christmas, how it was given, shared, and sometimes withheld. We look at how generosity reinforced power, how charity stitched communities together, and how feasting became a tool for both inclusion and exclusion. The Lord's table, hospitality as authority. In manorial society, lords were expected to host. On Christmas, this expectation was more than social, it was cultural and religious. It fulfilled multiple functions. It displayed the wealth and power of the household. It reminded tenants of their dependence on the manor. It offered a spiritual image of divine generosity, a microcosm of heavenly hospitality. Feasts hosted by nobles often included household members and retainers, tenants and laborers to a limited extent, visiting clergy or dignitaries, entertainers or minstrels, sometimes paid in food. The event was often hierarchical. The high table served refined dishes, boar's head, spiced wine, pastries. Lower tables received simpler fare, pottage, bread, roasted meats. Still, the gesture of inclusion mattered. Even receiving a slice of pie or a tankard of ale reminded the lower classes that they were, however temporarily, part of the manor's celebration. And woe to the lord who failed to offer a feast. He risked being seen as stingy, impious, or weak. Monasteries and the charity of Christmas. The church, through monasteries and parish institutions, also played a vital role in the Christmas food economy. Monastic rules, such as the Rule of St. Benedict, emphasized hospitality as sacred duty. At Christmas, this took specific forms. Guests and pilgrims were welcomed, fed, and housed. The poor were given food at the gates or through almoners. Special bread or broth was distributed on feast days. Leftover food from monastic tables was shared, sometimes even as part of public ceremonies. Monks and nuns also prepared food with spiritual symbolism. Nativity bread, shaped like the Christ child. Figgy puddings with symbolic fruits. Figs equals knowledge, raisins equals the harvest. Wafers and honey, linking the sweetness of salvation with physical nourishment. These acts were more than charity, they were spiritual expressions of the incarnation, the divine becoming flesh, and thus caring for bodily needs. Almsgiving and the poor, a fragile lifeline. For the poor, Christmas was a hopeful time, when social norms briefly softened. Begging was more accepted, even expected during the season. Many towns and parishes held alms distributions on Christmas Day or Boxing Day, December 26. The giving of soul cakes, ale, or coins was common. Some households prepared extra loaves of bread specifically for the needy. Children, widows, the sick, and travelers might receive a hot meal, a mug of ale, a bundle of firewood, a portion of meat or cheese, or even leftovers from the feast, a meaningful gift when nothing is wasted. This giving was not purely selfless. It was seen as a way to gain spiritual merit, to imitate Christ's humility, to feed him and the hungry. But for the recipients, it could mean the difference between survival and starvation during the long winter. Gifts of food between neighbors. Beyond institutional giving, medieval communities also practiced neighborly exchange, often informal, always meaningful. A woman might bring freshly baked bread to a sick neighbor. A tenant might offer a gift of eggs or ale to their reeve. A small family might exchange dishes of food with a larger household, ensuring everyone tasted something special. These exchanges reinforced local relationships. They built networks of mutual aid. They helped settle minor debts or disputes. They marked moments of trust and connection. Especially in tight-knit villages, the giving of food was a quiet language of care. Christmas boxes, gifts, and symbolism. While we often think of presents as objects wrapped in ribbons, many medieval Christmas gifts were edible. Examples included a small wheel of cheese, a jar of preserved fruit, a loaf of fine white bread, a luxury item, a meat pie or pudding, a bottle of spiced wine or ale, a dried sausage or ham. These were practical, perishable, and precious. They represented effort and affection. The practice of boxing food for servants, and the poor, the origin of Boxing Day, reflected the recognition that even those who labored through the feast deserved their share. A gift of food said, "I see you, I remember you, I share what I have." Food as a mirror of social order. Still, food could also reflect inequality. The quality and quantity of food marked status. Some people could afford spices, imported nuts, or multiple dishes. Others subsisted on broth, porridge, and hope. Even within charitable giving, the giver held power. They chose who received what and how much. Feasting, then, could reinforce hierarchy as much as it celebrated community. Yet paradoxically, even the acknowledgement of that structure through acts of giving helped stabilize society. The long aftermath of the feast. After Christmas, the food economy returned to normal. Leftovers were repurposed or stored. The wealthy resumed more restrained meals. The poor returned to thin pottage and hard bread. Brewing and baking resumed with everyday ingredients. But the memory of the feast lingered. It reminded people of the turning year, of the possibility of joy, of the necessity of sharing. In a world without abundance, these moments were profound. They gave meaning not just to meals, but to community, survival, and belief. Echoes into the present. Today, we may shop in grocery aisles, scroll through recipe apps, or order takeout in minutes. but the idea of the Christmas feast as a social bond endures. When we cook for others, bring cookies to a neighbor, or donate to a food bank, we echo these older rhythms. Feast after fast, hospitality to the stranger, bread broken in gratitude, the sacred made material. To eat together at Christmas, whether richly or simply, is to participate in a tradition older than any cookbook or holiday special. It is to say, we are here, we share this, we are not alone. Story 7. Holy Days and Labor Laws, Time Off at Christmas in the Medieval World. In the quiet chill of a December morning in 14th century England, a field remains untouched. The oxen are idle. A cobbler puts away his tools. The market is empty, but inside the parish church, candles flicker and the stone walls echo with chant. It is Christmas, and for once the rhythms of labor pause. But how did medieval people understand the idea of time off? How did they negotiate rest in a world where survival depended on nearly constant toil? And what role did the church and its calendar play in shaping the patterns of work and rest? In this first section of Story 7, we explore the origins and function of holy days, from church-mandated feasts to customary pauses in labor. We examine how the liturgical calendar offered not only spiritual guidance but practical breaks from unrelenting work, especially during the Christmas season. Work, rest, and the agrarian clock. In a society where over 90% of people worked the land, the concept of a weekend or even predictable leisure was foreign. Time was measured not by clocks but by the sun, the seasons, religious festivals, the needs of animals and crops. Labor was dictated by what needed doing. Plowing in spring, haymaking in summer, harvesting in autumn, slaughtering and mending in winter. Rest happened when rest was possible, or when it was mandated by religious authority. Enter the church calendar, which introduced a rhythm of intermittent holidays, or holy days, many of which granted partial or full rest from work. What was a holy day? The word holiday derives from holy day, a day set aside for religious observance, typically including attendance at Mass and abstention from certain types of labor. By the late Middle Ages, the average year included around 40 to 50 Sundays, dozens of feast days, depending on region, octaves, 8-day celebrations after major feasts, rogation and ember days, minor fasts and prayers, special feast periods, like the 12 days of Christmas. Some estimates suggest that a third of the year involved some form of holy day observance, though not all of them meant full rest. Labor restrictions varied by region, occupation, type of day, major versus minor feast. Class, peasants might work more than craftsmen. But for Christmas, that was different. The 12 days, a true holiday season. In medieval Europe, Christmas Day was not the end of the season, it was the beginning. From December 25th to January 6th, Epiphany, the church celebrated the 12 days of Christmas, a continuous festal period. During this time, work was minimized or halted entirely in many areas. Courts did not sit, and legal processes paused. Markets were closed or operated minimally. Manual labor was discouraged, though necessary household and farm tasks continued. This period was sacred but also festive. It was marked by church services, feasting, music and games, gift-giving, rest from field work. The long break after Christmas reflected both liturgical significance and practical necessity. Fields lay fallow, and daylight was limited. Guilds, craftsmen, and urban time off. In cities and towns, labor rhythms were more regulated than on the land. Guilds, associations of craftsmen and tradespeople, often governed when and how people could work. During Christmas, guild halls might host feasts and processions. Apprentices and journeymen often had guaranteed days off. Masters were expected to feed or gift their workers. Churches held special masses for guild members. Some trades paused longer than others. For example, tanners and butchers might see smelly or disruptive work. Bakers and brewers often worked part of the season to support feasting. Weavers and tailors paused production, using the time to prepare for winter. Urban regulations sometimes specified which days were legal rest days, and breaking these rules by forcing labor or ignoring feast customs could result in fines or public shame. The social function of time off. Time off wasn't merely a luxury, it had deep communal function. Holy days allowed for worship. Mass attendance was a social and spiritual obligation. Charity, alms, and hospitality increased during feast times. Reaffirming bonds, families, villages, and guilds gathered to celebrate. Storytelling and games, these reinforced shared culture and local tradition. Temporary equality, social inversions like the Feast of Fools allowed workers or servants to parody their masters for a day. These pauses in labor acted as pressure valves offering relief, laughter, and renewal. The church calendar, therefore, was not only a religious system, but also a labor calendar, structuring when people could rest, celebrate, or be still. The limits of leisure. Of course, not all labor stopped. Servants in elite households worked harder during feast days to prepare meals and attend to guests. Women continued with childcare, cooking, and laundry, much of which intensified during holidays. Farmers still tended animals, chopped wood, and repaired tools. In monasteries, though some labor was reduced, liturgical obligations increased: more prayers, more services, more preparation. So while the calendar gave space for rest, that rest was unevenly distributed. Social rank, gender, and local customs shaped who truly got time off. Resistance and enforcement. There were cases where the line between holy days and labor days blurred. Some peasants worked fields during minor feasts out of necessity. Lords or landlords might pressure tenants to continue tasks despite feast observances. Bishops and church courts sometimes issued fines for laboring on holy days, especially if it was public or profane. Yet, by and large, Christmas retained a protected space in the social consciousness. To work through it not out of emergency, but by design was seen not just as uncouth, but unchristian. Measuring rest in an unmeasured world. We tend to measure time by vacation days and work weeks, by hours logged and schedules kept. Medieval people lived by a different clock, one of feast and fast, of toil and pause. The Christmas season offered predictable time off, woven into the very structure of belief. But beneath this structure lay deeper questions. Who decided when rest was allowed? Did everyone benefit equally? And was the time off truly free, or simply a shift in duties? These questions echo into our modern notions of labor, leisure, and what it means to take a holiday. As we'll see in the next section, the sacred calendar also began to influence secular law, shaping labor protections, wage expectations, and the cultural weight of time away from work. The bells toll through a gray December sky, and a clerk reaches for a worn sheaf of parchment. A statute is read aloud in the square. No legal business until after Epiphany. Markets are closed. Courts are silent. Even disputes must wait. Across the medieval world, time off at Christmas was not just custom, it was increasingly codified. Over centuries, the rhythms of religious life shaped not only when people celebrated, but how their time was protected, regulated, and respected. In this second section of Story 7, we turn from the rhythms of the liturgical calendar to the growing influence of laws, statutes, and civic governance in granting and enforcing time off during the Christmas season. We explore how religious observance became entwined with early labor regulation, and how Christmas became a legal holiday long before the concept existed in modern form. From holy days to legal holidays. In medieval Europe, particularly in England, holy days slowly gained legal recognition as days on which normal operations, especially judicial and commercial, were suspended. This did not happen all at once. It emerged gradually through canon law, the law of the church; customary law, local tradition with quasi-legal weight; royal statutes and proclamations; guild and borough regulations. For example, Christmas Day was universally observed as a non-working day by the 12th century in nearly every Christian region. But beyond the day itself, the 12 days of Christmas increasingly acquired formal status. By the late Middle Ages, no courts sat between December 25 and January 6. Legal contracts and writs were suspended. Debts could not be collected during this time. Markets and fairs were forbidden on major feast days. Military campaigns were rarely launched over Christmas. These regulations protected not only rest, but the sacred character of the season. Royal edicts and civic enforcement. English kings from the 13th century onward issued occasional proclamations to reinforce the sanctity of Christmas. Edward I ordered restraint from unnecessary work during holy days. Edward III issued instructions to sheriffs to cease legal summons over Christmas. Henry VI encouraged charity and hospitality, not only as virtue but as social expectation. Meanwhile, cities and boroughs developed local ordinances. In London, civic officers enforced the closure of shops on major holy days. In York and Norwich, guilds set specific holidays for each trade, often including the full Christmas season. Inns were expected to limit disruptive behavior during sacred days, blending rest with restraint. This web of law and local rule reinforced Christmas as a protected period, shaped as much by faith as by the growing power of municipal governance. Guild rules and workers' rights, sort of. Guilds, those powerful associations of craftsmen, traders, and artisans, played a major role in regulating time off. Each guild had its own patron saint, feast day calendar, holiday schedules. Many included clauses about Christmas, mandating at least 3 days off, often the entire 12, providing feasts or payments to members during the season, prohibiting workshops from opening or members from taking jobs during sacred days. Apprentices were sometimes granted Boar's Head Day or St. Stephen's Day off, a meal at the master's table during the holidays, a rare chance to rest without losing pay. However, these benefits were often contingent. Misbehavior or poor performance could forfeit privileges. Not all workers were in guilds. Unregulated laborers had fewer protections. Domestic servants typically worked harder during holidays to support their households. Still, guild rules marked a meaningful step toward structured labor rights, with Christmas offering one of the few guaranteed pauses in the calendar. Legal time off for the elite and everyone else. The medieval legal system itself slowed during Christmas. Royal courts recessed. Local manorial courts ceased hearing pleas. Ecclesiastical courts paused proceedings unless emergencies arose. Even debt collections were deferred. It was customary, and sometimes codified, that no debtor could be jailed or fined during the 12 days of Christmas. Legal documents often excluded holy days from timelines or obligations. This didn't mean that poor litigants or peasants could relax completely, but it did offer a reprieve from pressure, a rare moment of quiet in legal affairs, a built-in grace period during the darkest days of winter. Christmas was one of the few times when law, custom, and religion aligned to protect the vulnerable, at least briefly. Religious enforcement and social discipline. The church not only set the rhythm of the year, it policed it. Bishops and abbots had authority to fine or excommunicate those who violated holy day rest. Parish priests often publicly named or shamed people who labored unnecessarily during Christmas. Penitentials, books of confession, included penalties for merchants, bakers, or laborers who worked on major feasts. These rules were taken seriously. To work on Christmas without just cause was considered a form of sacrilege, disrespectful to both God and community. But there were exceptions. Travelers and pilgrims were often exempt. Tasks related to hospitality, charity, or worship, like preparing meals or caring for the sick, were permitted. Monks and nuns, though restricted in some ways, were expected to increase their liturgical labor, adding to the irony of rest. So while religious law offered protection, it also created new forms of obligation, especially for the devout. Time off as a social right. By the 15th century, the idea that everyone deserved some time off at Christmas, even the lowest laborer, had taken hold in many parts of Europe. Custom and expectation created a kind of social contract. Lords provided alms or gifts to their tenants. Masters allowed rest or feasts for their servants. The church reminded all classes of the duty to imitate divine generosity. This time off was earned through a year of labor, granted through the authority of church and law, expected as part of the communal rhythm. Though far from equitable, it reflected a growing sense that rest was not merely religious, but socially necessary. Fragile privilege in a hard world. Still, none of this should be romanticized. For many peasants, time off meant no wages. Feasting required sacrifices of stored food. Illness or weather could spoil the season entirely. For laborers and domestic workers, time off often meant a shift in duties, not true leisure. Rest was conditional on behavior and status. Legal protections were inconsistent and often unenforced. And yet, the idea that Christmas meant rest endured. It created space, if only a small one, for the idea that work should not be constant, that celebration had its place, and that time belonged not just to toil, but to grace. In the final section, we'll explore what people actually did with this time off, how they celebrated, relaxed, and sometimes turned the season into a stage for social satire, play, and joy. The fire glows, the tools rest, the children play. In a world that so rarely paused, the 12 days of Christmas offered something rare, not only the absence of labor, but the presence of leisure, even joy. But what did medieval people actually do with this time? We step into the stillness of medieval Christmas time. We look beyond church and statute to the ordinary lived experience of the days between December 25 and January 6. This is where law met life, where sacred pause turned into secular play, and where rest became a shared ritual of song, satire, storytelling, and slow winter days. First, they went to church. Nearly everyone in medieval Europe was expected to attend Mass on Christmas Day, and most people did. But the liturgical calendar didn't stop there. December 26, Feast of St. Stephen, patron of deacons and the poor. December 27, Feast of St. John the Evangelist. December 28, Holy Innocents' Day, commemorating the children slain by Herod. January 1, Feast of the Circumcision. January 6, Epiphany, marking the arrival of the Magi. Each of these feasts included church services, special hymns or prayers, sometimes small rituals, e.g., drinking St. John's wine on December 27. For many, these days structured the holidays not only spiritually, but socially. You went to church, and then you went visiting. Hospitality and visiting, the original social network. With markets closed and fields quiet, people turned toward one another. Visiting during the Christmas season was a cherished tradition. Families visited neighbors and extended kin. Tenants sometimes visited their lord to offer good wishes and receive ale or food in return. The poor might visit multiple homes to receive charity, a custom tied to St. Stephen's Day. These visits were rarely scheduled. People dropped in bringing a loaf of bread, a jug of warmed ale, a handful of nuts or dried fruit, sometimes nothing at all but greetings and gossip. These gatherings built community, reaffirmed status, and spread seasonal cheer, even in the coldest months. Feasting and food rituals. As detailed in Story 6, food was central to the Christmas holiday. But what exactly did people eat with their time off? Typical fare might include roast meats, especially goose, beef, or rarely boar; meat pies with dried fruit and spices; pottage, enriched with butter or egg for the season; cheese, bread, and butter; spiced ale, mulled wine, or wassail, a hot, sweetened beverage; wafers and sweetmeats for those who could afford them. In wealthier homes, the feast could last multiple days, with courses and entertainment. In modest homes, even a single meat dish was a symbol of celebration. Families might also engage in blessing their food, offering toasts to each other, and sharing saved delicacies, proof of careful preparation through the autumn months. Games, revels, and Christmas misrule. When the work stopped, play began. From the manor to the village green, people used the 12 days for board games, dice, nine men's Morris, and early chess; storytelling, often long, winding tales with moral or comic twists; dancing, in homes, halls, and sometimes churches if permitted; singing, carols, chants, and drinking songs; masquerades and disguises, see Story 5 on mumming. One of the most distinctive customs was misrule, the deliberate inversion of social order, permitted within limits during this holiday. Examples include boy bishops, young choir boys appointed to mock episcopal office, leading processions; Feast of Fools, clergy and townsfolk engaging in parody masses and humorous rituals; mock lords and kings, a lord of misrule might oversee games, joke trials, or role reversals in noble households. These activities served both release and reinforcement. By playfully overturning order, society reaffirmed its own structure. Storytelling and memory. Winter evenings were long, the light was low, and so people told stories sometimes for hours. Popular types of tales included saints' lives, adapted for entertainment; animal fables, like Renard the Fox; local legends, tied to villages or landmarks; moral tales, emphasizing virtue, humor, or irony; ghost stories, especially around New Year's Eve. Tales were told orally, but they followed patterns and cadences familiar across Europe. They filled the silence, bridged generations, and helped pass along memory and meaning. Work that never paused. While the general rhythm of the holidays included rest, not all work stopped. Women continued household labor, baking, mending, tending fires. Servants in noble household worked extended hours to support banquets and guests. Bakers, brewers, and butchers in towns might be called upon to supply seasonal needs. Monks and nuns increased their prayer obligations, some rising multiple times per night. Even peasants had tasks: feeding livestock, cutting firewood, guarding stores from theft or cold, brewing small ale, or preparing preserved food for the months ahead. But these duties were often reframed as part of the sacred season, not an interruption of it. Marking time, calendars, caution, and chain. Some homes tracked the 12 days carefully, marking each with a special meal, a local superstition, e.g., weather on each day predicting the next 12 months, a song or reading. People believed that what you did on Christmas Day, you do all year. Ill words spoken during the 12 days had extra weight. Dreams during this period might carry meaning. Nothing important, no new jobs, marriages, or legal matters should be started. It was a liminal time, neither fully part of the old year nor fully belonging to the new. As such, it invited both reflection and play, care and chaos. The end of the pause, Epiphany and return. January 6 Epiphany marked the end of Christmas. In churches, the Magi were honored, often with plays or readings. In some areas, the king cake was shared, and whoever found the bean or token became king for the night. Feasting might continue through Twelfth Night, but the tone began to shift. After that, fields beckoned. Guilds resumed meetings. Markets reopened. Courts began to sit again. The brief sacred pause ended. The world returned to work. But the memory lingered. For a fortnight, people had lived in another rhythm, one of suspended labor, of song and food, of ritual and inversion. They had experienced what was perhaps the medieval world's greatest gift, time, however brief, that was not owned by toil. The legacy of medieval time off. Much of our modern sense of holiday time comes from this world. The 12 days became the foundation for Christmas vacations. The idea of a legal holiday grew from the statutes protecting sacred days. Even modern labor movements cited medieval feast days as precedent when arguing for time off. And the deeper idea endures, that rest is not just a relief, but a right, and that joy, too, has its place in the calendar. So next time you find yourself between years, counting days and wondering how to spend them, remember, your ancestors were doing the same. In the stillness of winter, they too told stories, shared bread, sang softly, and looked ahead.